Norfolk. The year is 1321. There is a priory at Shudham, and inside its walls there lives a canon named William de Spalding. And on this particular afternoon, William de Spalding is playing a ball game. Hold that picture, because it is the least remarkable thing you will hear tonight. A man in a religious house, out on the grass, in ordinary daylight, kicking a ball around with his friends. No spectacle, no stakes, no crowd. Just a body doing what bodies do when they are briefly, blessedly, not required anywhere else. A day free of obligation, spent the way people have spent free days. For as long as there have been free days and balls to kick across them, he kicks the ball. A lay friend of his runs against him. Running at the ball, running at the man, running the way you run when you are winning and do not yet know that you aren't. And here the record offers a detail so quietly strange that it feels invented. The friend is also named William. 2 Williams, 1 ball, and on the cannon's belt, a knife. Sheathed. Not drawn. Not raised. Not brandished in temper. Sheathed. Hanging on his hip the way a knife hung on the hip. Of nearly every person alive in 1321, because a knife then was less a weapon than a piece of cutlery. The thing you cut your bread with, cut your meat with, cut a strap or a string or a stubborn knot with. You did not carry it because you expected violence. You carried it because you expected lunch. The lay William runs against the canon William, and he is wounded on the sheathed knife. He does not die there on the grass. That is the part that lodges in you. He dies 6 days later. 6 days. Time to be carried indoors. Time for the priory to hope, and then to hope less, and then to stop pretending it was hoping. 6 days of a canon sitting somewhere in that house, listening to footsteps in a corridor, learning the specific arithmetic of a man's breathing. However bad you imagine an accident to be, 6 days is worse than instant, because 6 days is long enough to rehearse every possible version of the moment and discover that none of them meant differently. Then the friend dies. And then, because this is the 14th century and the church has a category for everything, the machinery turns. William de Spalding is suspended from all clerical duty, everything. The offices, the altar, the whole architecture of a life he had presumably spent his adult years building. Nobody calls it murder. Nobody suggests malice. There was no quarrel, no grudge, no drawn blade. There was a game and a body and an unlucky angle, but a man in holy orders whose person had ended a human life, had become, in the eyes of canon law, a problem, and the law did not especially care that his hands had been busy with a football at the time, so he appeals, not to a local court, not to his prior, not to some sympathetic official with a jug of ale and a shrug. He appeals to the Pope, to John XXIII, personally, because when your life comes apart on a Tuesday, the medieval remedy is a document, and the document must come from the top. And here is the astonishing part. It works. In 1321, a dispensation is granted. No blame attaches. The ruling notes, and I want you to sit with this phrasing as you lie there in the dark, that the canon felt deeply the death, and that he feared what his enemies might say. Feared what his enemies might say. A man cleared by a pope formally in writing, absolved of a death that everybody involved agrees was an accident, and still, somewhere in a cold Norfolk priory, awake, wondering who is talking about him. Some anxieties are simply not medieval or modern. Some anxieties are just furniture in the human head, and we have been tripping over them in the dark for 700 years. It stands as one of the earliest documented fatal accidents in an English football game, which tells you something about football, and something about record keeping, and something about the priorities of the people who decided which pieces of paper were worth saving. And it was not as if nobody had noticed the problem. 7 years earlier, in 1314, Edward II had proclaimed a ban on football in London, to preserve the peace, as though the game were a weather event. Authority had already looked at people enjoying themselves in a public space and concluded, with a sigh you can almost hear across the centuries, that this could only end in paperwork. Historians still argue whether those bans were ever really about public order at all, or whether a crown that depended on skilled archers simply resented every idle hour. Its subjects spent kicking a ball across a field instead of drawing a bow, which would make the very first football ban in English history. Not a safety measure, but a workplace productivity policy. So that is where we begin. Not with a king, not with a battle, not with a cathedral. With a man who played a game on his day off and lost everything he had. The friend, the office, the ordinary certainty that a free afternoon is a safe place to be, because it raises the question this whole night is built around. We talk a great deal now about how relaxed the medieval world supposedly was. Fewer hours, more holidays, long naps in warm fields, and we are going to look at all of that honestly, including the parts that fall apart when you press them. But before we do, William de Spalding is standing there on the grass at Shudham, wanting nothing more than one uncomplicated hour, and the hour is taking everything from him. What did rest actually cost these people? And what, underneath the ball games and the bells and the ale, did it actually mean? That is what we're going to spend tonight finding out slowly, at the pace of a man walking home in the dark. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're still holding your phone, do me one small favour. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are and what the local time is right now. I love reading them. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that somebody is hearing this at 2 a.m. in Manila, while somebody else has it on over breakfast in Lisbon, and a third person is stuck on a bus somewhere in Ohio pretending to work. Tell me your city. Tell me your hour. We will build a little map of the night together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are waking up. Not to an alarm. There is no alarm. There is no bedside table, no glowing rectangle telling you that you have already failed the day by 6 minutes. You're in an English village, late in the 14th century, and you're waking because your body has finished a thing it started at sundown. The first thing you notice is the dark. Not the dim, orange half-dark, you know, the one leaking in around curtains from a streetlight 2 doors down. Real dark. Dark with weight to it. Dark that presses on your open eyes exactly as hard as it presses on your closed ones, so that for a moment you genuinely cannot tell which state you're in. The second thing you notice is the cold on your face, and only your face, because everything below your chin is buried under wool that smells of wool and of smoke, and faintly of the animal it used to be. Your nose is cold, your ears are cold, the rest of you is a warm sealed parcel, and moving so much as a knee will break the seal. The third thing you notice is that you are awake, thoroughly awake in the middle of the night, and you're not remotely worried about it. Which is the strangest sensation of all, because here is what has happened to you, and it happened without your permission, or your knowledge, or a single conscious decision on your part. You have finished your first sleep. Not nap, not doze, not a fragment of a sleep you were supposed to be having in one continuous 8-hour block. A first sleep, a whole and complete and named thing, with a beginning and an end, and a second sleep waiting patiently on the other side of it like a second course. You went down shortly after sundown, because sundown is when the light went and light was expensive. You lay down in the dark and slept a good solid stretch, and now, sometime after midnight, your body has surfaced on its own with no assistance and simply stopped. Not out of distress, not because a car alarm went off or your bladder staged a coup, or your brain remembered an email from 2019 that it wants to reconsider. It stopped because it was finished with that part. And the truly disorienting thing, lying there in the wool dark, is the total absence of panic. You know this feeling in your own life, but you know it as an emergency. 3 a.m, eyes open, the ceiling doing nothing, and the immediate arithmetic starting up in your head like a machine you cannot switch off. 4 hours and 40 minutes until the alarm, 4 hours and 39. If I fall asleep right now, I can still get. If I fall asleep in the next 10 minutes, I can still. Oh good, now it's 4 hours and 12. That arithmetic is a modern invention. It requires a clock. It requires a schedule the clock is measuring you against. It requires the existence of a number you can fall below. Lying here in the 14th century, there is no number. There is nothing to fall below. There is dark, and there is wool, and there is the fact that you are awake, and none of these facts are in conflict with each other. We know about this because someone went looking. A historian named A. Roger Kirsch spent years down in the material that nobody had thought to cross-reference. Diaries, medical books, court records, plays, poems, the enormous unglamorous paper sediment of ordinary life, and he came back up with more than 500 references to a first sleep and a second sleep. 500. In every kind of source, from every kind of person, scattered across centuries. All of them referring to this pattern in the same offhand way you might refer to lunch. He published it in 2005 in a book called At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, and the argument is simple enough to sit in one sentence. For a very long time, people did not sleep the way you sleep. They slept in 2 pieces with a hole in the middle, and the hole was normal. That is what makes those 500 references so striking. Not their number, their tone. Nobody explains it. Nobody defines it. It is never introduced as a curiosity. Somebody just writes that a thing happened after their first sleep, the way you would write that a thing happened after lunch, with a total confidence that the reader knows what lunch is. The pattern is invisible in the sources precisely because it was too obvious to mention. It only became visible when it was gone, and a man in a library noticed a phrase that no longer had a meaning attached to it. Historians still argue whether the pattern was really as universal as that mountain of references makes it look. In 2023, a paper came out with the deliberately provocative title, "Have We Lost Sleep? Reconsidering Segmented Sleep in Early Modern England," and suggesting the evidence has been read a little too neatly, that first sleep might sometimes be a figure of speech rather than a schedule, that people who wrote things down were not a representative sample of people who slept. Which is a fair hit. The diarists of history were, almost by definition, the sort of people who had candles, leisure and opinions. The rest of the village was not writing anything down at 2 a.m, on account of being asleep, or busy, or illiterate, or all three. But go back to the wool. Whatever the argument does to the statistics, it cannot do much to you right now. Because you are awake at an hour that your own century has taught you to fear, and you feel completely fine. Let your eyes work for a moment. They are adjusting, and there is more here than you first thought. Not light exactly, the memory of light. A low red pulse from the hearth, where the fire has been banked down for the night, covered and starved and left just barely alive, the way you would leave a thing you cannot afford to lose. That is not decoration. Fire is expensive. Fire is the difference between mourning and misery. Somebody smothered that fire carefully before lying down, and somebody will uncover it carefully at dawn, and the whole house has been organised around this small orange animal for as long as the house has stood. The smoke sits above you in a layer. You can feel where it is without seeing it. The air at head height is one thing, and the air a foot higher is another, thicker and older and slightly sweet. Your throat knows the difference even if your eyes don't. This is the smell that will live in your clothes and your hair and your skin, and it will not occur to you as a smell at all, any more than the smell of your own house occurs to you. It is simply what air is, under the smoke, the animals, somewhere near, breathing. Large, patient, unhurried breathing, the sound of a creature with no plans. If there is one thing that will genuinely undo a modern person about a medieval night, it is not the dark or the cold, it is the roommates. The livestock are inside because the livestock are the entire savings account of the household, and you do not leave your savings account outdoors in November where anything with hands or teeth can help itself. And the cold, working at the edges of you, cold on the tip of your nose, cold on the shell of your ear, the precise geography of the parts of you that the wool does not reach, mapped out in fine detail by the temperature so that you could draw yourself blindfolded. Now here is the thing that changes everything. The small hinge on which this whole night swings. You're not going to lie here counting the hours until dawn. You're not going to try to force yourself back down and fail, and get angry about failing, and then get anxious about the anger. You're not going to reach for anything that glows. You're going to do the ordinary, expected, entirely unremarkable thing. You're going to be awake for a while, because this hour is not a mistake in the middle of your sleep. This hour has a purpose, and a character. And as far as anyone can tell from what people left behind, it was quite possibly the best hour of the entire day. So you shift. Carefully, because of the seal, because breaking the wool means letting the cold in, and it will take a full minute to earn that warmth back. And a minute is a long time when you're paying for it in shivering. And then you just lie there, in the hole between the sleeps, and the hour begins. Nobody has written a manual for this hour. There is no medieval treatise on what to do between your first sleep and your second, which is a shame, because it would sell extremely well right now to a certain kind of person with a meditation app and a weighted blanket and a deep suspicion that they are doing rest wrong. But the pattern shows up all over the sources anyway, in the corners of things, in the incidental way people mention what they were doing. When the world was dark and they were not asleep. They prayed. That one is everywhere, and it makes a particular kind of sense. An hour of guaranteed quiet in a dark room, with no possibility of interruption, in a culture that took the invisible seriously. If you were going to talk to something larger than yourself, you would struggle to design a better slot for it. They read. When there was anything to read and any light to read it by, which for most people in a village like this one means not much and not often. Reading in the dark is a luxury with a fuel bill attached. They talked. This one might be the most important, and it is the easiest to skip past. Two people, awake in the dark, warm, unhurried, with nowhere to be and nothing to look at. No screen, no ceiling to stare at meaningfully, nothing to do with the hour except each other's company. There is a strong argument that an enormous amount of what a household actually needed to say to itself, the worries, the plans, the small grievances, the things you cannot say across a table in daylight with the neighbours listening through a wall, got said in this hour, in the dark, at low volume, and then got slept on immediately afterwards. Which, honestly, is better conflict resolution than most of us manage, with the benefit of therapy and a shared calendar. And they had sex. This is stated plainly enough in the sources that it does not need dressing up, and one 16th century doctor is on record reckoning it was the better time for it. After the first sleep, rested, warm, with more energy for the business, than at the end of a day that had begun before sunrise and involved a field. Which is one of those historical footnotes that manages to be simultaneously charming and slightly embarrassing, because it is difficult to read it without concluding that a physician 500 years ago had a firmer grasp of scheduling than you do. Then, when the hour is spent, and nobody times it, nobody knows how long it lasted as long as it lasted, you go back down. Second sleep, straight through until the sky starts to change. 2 sleeps, 1 seam, and the day arrives when the light does. Now, the strange part. The part that should make you sit up, except that you are extremely warm and you're not going to. This pattern disappears, not gradually across all of human history, abruptly in the scheme of things. The references thin out in the late 17th century and then they are simply gone, and within a few generations nobody knows what a first sleep is. A phrase that everybody understood so completely that nobody bothered to explain it becomes a phrase that means nothing at all. And stays meaningless for 300 years until a historian goes rummaging in the archives and finds 500 people casually mentioning a thing that no longer exists. And the suspects for the murder are these. Street lighting first, because once you can light a street the night stops being a wall and starts being a room. The dark had been a hard boundary, a thing that closed the world at sundown and reopened it at dawn, and lamps took a hammer to that boundary and never gave it back. Sundown stops, meaning bedtime. Evening gets invented, everything shifts later, and the first sleep gets squeezed from the front. And second, this is the one that matters for tonight. So keep hold of it. A new sensitivity to time, a new self-consciousness about efficiency, a creeping sense that the hours were a resource, that a resource could be wasted. And that lying awake in the dark, talking quietly to somebody you love was, when you examined it in this new light, technically a waste. Read that again in the dark. The hour did not become impossible. It became embarrassing. It stopped being what the night was for and started being what the night was interrupted by. The same hour, unchanged minute for minute, reclassified. Yesterday it was the shape of the night. Today it is insomnia, and there is a product for it. Historians still argue whether the whole thing collapsed for exactly those reasons, or whether it was ever quite as tidy and universal as 500 quotations make it look. The 2023 reconsideration of segmented sleep in early modern England leans hard on the possibility that we have taken a loose habit and pressed it into a schedule, because a schedule is a better story. And they may be right. History is full of patterns that turn out to be the shape of the archive, rather than the shape of the people. But allow me a small unscientific observation, offered without a footnote and at low volume, because it is the middle of the night. A great many people currently alive wake at around 2 a.m, wide awake, for an hour or so, and then get sleepy again. And every one of them thinks something is wrong with them. That is the whole trick of tonight, right there in one sentence. Not that these people were happier. We are going to spend a long while later on with famine and plague and the total absence of anywhere to go. And I am not going to sell you a warm bath of a story about how the 14th century was secretly lovely, because it wasn't. It was hard in ways that would break most of us inside a fortnight. But their time was shaped differently. It was not measured against a clock they could fail. You cannot be behind if there is nothing to be behind. You cannot lose an hour if the hour was never a countable thing you owned. And you cannot lie awake at 2 a.m. failing at sleep if the concept of failing at sleep has not yet been invented, because the hour you're lying awake in is not a hole in the night. It is a part of the night, with a name, and everyone you know is in it too. So lie there a little longer. The fire is a low red coal. The animals are breathing. Somebody near you is awake as well, and you both know it, and neither of you has said anything yet. And then, out in the dark, over the fields, something rings. A bell. Not close. Somewhere out past the crofts, thinned by distance and damp air, arriving softer than it left. It rings, and then it stops, and the silence afterwards is somehow louder than the bell was. Now, your modern hand is already twitching. Your modern brain has already done the thing, automatically, before you could stop it. It has tried to work out what time it is. Let that reflex go. Let it fall out of your hand into the dark, because it does not work here, and it will not work anywhere in this village, and the sooner you put it down, the sooner tonight will make sense. The bell is not telling you the time. The bell is telling you a thing has happened. Someone in the world is doing something, and the bell is the sound of that something being done, and it reaches you across the fields as information about an event rather than a position on a dial. It is not a number. It is news. This is the deepest and weirdest and most genuinely difficult idea in this whole story, and it is worth going slowly through it, because everything else, the work, the holidays, the ale, the arguments, the whole ledger we're going to try to balance honestly by the end of the night, sits on top of it. The historian who put his finger on it most precisely was E.P. Thompson, in an essay published in 1967 in a journal called Past and Present, with a title that sounds like homework and reads like a hand grabbing your collar: Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism. And the distinction at its heart is between two entirely different species of time. There is clock time. You are soaking in it. Time is a grid laid over the world in advance, ticking along indifferently whether or not anything is happening inside it. In clock time, you do not do a task, you spend an interval. Your hours are a currency. You sell them, you waste them, you save them, you find them, you lose them, you kill them. You can be given time and you can run out of it. And critically, this is the barb, the clock runs independently of you, which means the clock can get ahead of you, which means you can be behind. And then there is task time. Task orientation. The day is not a container that tasks are poured into. The day is the tasks. The work has its own natural duration, dictated by the thing itself. And when the thing is done, the thing is done. And if it takes longer today than yesterday, then today was longer than yesterday. That is not a delay. That is just what length is. Thompson's observation about task time is the one to hold. In a task-oriented world, there is the least possible demarcation between work and life. Social intercourse and labour intermingle. They are not separate substances. The talking is not a break from the work. The talking is happening while the work is happening, and both of them are simply the day going along. There is no clocking in because there is nothing to clock into. There is no clocking out because there is nowhere to go. And that cuts both ways, which is exactly why this is not a comfortable little story about how much better it all was. The good side is real and enormous. Nothing here is measuring you. There is no target, no rate, no quota, no dashboard, no one comparing this morning's output against last Tuesday's. You cannot underperform an afternoon. The cow takes as long as the cow takes, and no supervisor is going to appear at your shoulder to ask whether the cow could be optimized. You are not behind. You cannot be behind. The specific modern ache, that low background hum of lateness that follows you into the shower and onto the bus, and into bed at night, that particular sensation, the feeling of a clock quietly running somewhere with your name on it, has not been invented and will not be for centuries. But the bad side is real too, and it is exactly the same fact wearing a different coat. If work and life have the least possible demarcation, then work is everywhere. It has no edges. It does not stop, because stopping requires a boundary and there isn't one. You do not go home from it, you are already home, and the home is full of it, and the animals in the corner are it, and the roof over you is it, and the thing you will do at first light is it. There is no 5 o'clock to be saved by. There is no weekend on the horizon waiting to catch you. There is only the task and then the next task, and the fact that the light is running out. A modern person, told they will never be late again, tends to hear paradise. What they should also hear is that they will never be finished again either. Those are the same sentence. Pick it up from one end and it feels like freedom. Pick it up from the other and it feels like a life sentence with unusually good scenery. Historians still argue whether Thompson drew that line too cleanly, whether the medieval world was really so innocent of clock thinking, whether ordinary people were genuinely as unbothered by measured time as the theory needs them to be, or whether he built a rather romantic before in order to make his afterland harder. It is a fair suspicion. Every argument about how we lost something needs a something to have lost, and historians are as susceptible as anyone to the belief that things were more whole before the machines arrived. But the bell in the dark does not care about the argument. It has rung, and it has stopped, and you are lying here with your face cold, and the rest of you warm, and you're not counting anything. That is what the bell does here, in this village. It marks. It does not measure. It says a thing has begun, or a thing has ended, or a person has died, or a person is being buried, or come now, or stop now, or God help us all, look at the sky. The bell is not a clock face. It is a voice. And crucially, everyone hears it at once. That is the quiet marvel of a bell, and the reason it survives so long as the technology of choice for organising human beings. It does not tell one person anything privately. It arrives in every house in the parish in the same second, and every person in earshot receives the same fact at the same instant, and nobody had to be told individually, and nobody can pretend they missed it. It is the single most democratic piece of equipment in the village, and it belongs, of course, entirely to the church. There is more grey in the room, not light. The idea of light. The rectangle where the door is has begun to distinguish itself. From the wall around it, the fire has gone from red to almost nothing. Somewhere out there, the sky is deciding to happen, and with it, unfortunately, comes the working day. And I want to tell you how long that day is, and immediately I run into a problem because the honest answer is, as long as the light. That is not a dodge. That is the answer. Dawn to dusk, which in the deep green heart of an English summer is something on the order of 16 hours of usable daylight, and in the wet grey pit of December is something closer to 8. The same day, the same job, the same person, half the length. Nobody negotiated that, and nobody voted on it, and nobody could have changed it if they had wanted to, because the sun was not taking submissions. Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely alien. Your working day is a fixed rectangle that the year happens around. Their working day was made of the year. It swelled in June and shriveled in December, and a person born into this did not experience that as inconsistent, any more than you experience your own heart rate as inconsistent. It was simply what a day was, a quantity of light, doled out by the sky, non-negotiable, delivered fresh each morning in whatever amount was going, which meant summer was brutal and winter was not. 16 hours of light is not a gift, it is a demand, because everything that has to be done in a year has to be done in the months when there is enough light to do it in, and the sun is generous exactly when the work is heaviest, which is either a beautiful piece of natural design or a very long-running joke at your expense, depending on your back. Now, if you skip forward past this village, past your own life and your children's, to 1495, under Henry VII, you get one of the great deadpan documents of English history, an act that sets out to regulate the hours of labourers. And it is fascinating not for what it demands, but for the fact that it exists at all. In winter, the Act says, the working day runs from sunrise to sunset, which is to say, the law looked at the sun, considered its options, and agreed with the sun. That is legislation as pure theatre. That is Parliament passing a statute confirming that it gets dark. But in summer, it gets specific, and the specificity has teeth. 5 in the morning until 8 at night. 5 in the morning, written down, in a law, a number, attached to a moment applied to a person. And that, not the hours themselves, is the thing to notice, and the reason I have dragged you 100 years forward in the dark to look at it. Because for it to be worth writing down that a man should start at 5, 3 things must already be true. Somebody must be able to know that it is 5. Somebody must think it matters that it is 5 rather than half past. And somebody must have decided that the way to get the correct amount of work out of a human being is to name an hour and hold him to it. That is the clock arriving. Not the machine. The machine is a later part of tonight's story, and we will get to the day the mechanical clock turns up in a tower and starts telling everyone what they are. This is the idea arriving decades ahead of the hardware. The idea that time is a thing you can be measured against and found wanting. And once that idea is in a statute book, it never leaves. It goes on to become timesheets, and timekeepers, and fines, and informers, and eventually a small rectangle that vibrates on your bedside table at 6:45 whether or not you had a first sleep. And it did not come out of nowhere. Look back a century and a half to 1351, to the Statute of Labourers, passed in the wreckage after the Black Death, when so many people had died that the survivors made the entirely reasonable discovery that their labour was suddenly scarce, and therefore worth more, and began asking for more of what it was worth. The response was not the market. The response was a law, capping wages and compelling people to work, which is one of the more clarifying documents ever produced by an English parliament, because it says out loud that when ordinary people accidentally gain a little leverage, The machinery's first instinct is to make the leverage illegal, so hold both of those in your hands. 1351. You will work, and you will take what you are given. 1495. And you will start at 5. But here is the twist, and it is the twist the whole tidy story keeps tripping over. That long legislated dawn to dusk day was not a solid block. It was full of holes, riddled with them, because the day in practice is intermittent. It has breakfast in it. It has lunch in it. It has dinner in it. It has a refreshment break in the mid-morning and another one in the mid-afternoon. Both of them customary. Both of them expected, neither of them a favour anyone was doing you. And famously, and slightly infuriatingly, if you have ever eaten a sandwich standing up over a bin, it has an afternoon nap in it. Customary. Not stolen, not sneaked, not a thing you did with one eye on the door. A nap that everyone agrees is part of the shape of an afternoon. 16 hours then, with a nap in the middle, which is a fundamentally different animal from 16 hours, and you can see immediately why anyone trying to add up medieval working hours ends up with a headache and a footnote. What do you count? The hours between the first stroke of work and the last, or only the hours where a hand is actually moving? Because those are wildly different numbers, and the gap between them is where every argument about this subject has been fought for the last 30 years. Historians still argue whether that intermittent nap-punctuated day adds up to something genuinely lighter than a modern one, or whether we have simply fallen in love with the nap and quietly declined to add up everything around it. And we will get properly into that fight later tonight, with the actual numbers and the people who like them, and the people who think they have been oversold. I am not going to pretend that argument is settled, because it isn't, but the shape of it is not really in dispute. Long and slow and full of holes and stretched or shrunk by the sky rather than by a schedule. Which is why, when the grey in the doorway finally becomes light, and you push the wool back and let the cold have you all at once, you're not late for anything. You're simply the next person up. So the statute says 5 in the morning until 8 at night, and somewhere behind your ribs a small modern animal begins to panic. 15 hours of summer, laid end to end, with a King's Parliament putting its seal on the arrangement in 1495 as though it were doing everybody a kindness. You hear that and you think, well, that settles it. They were worked to splinters, and my life is a spa, and I shall never complain about a meeting again. Hold that thought. Now carry it outside into the wet grass and watch what happens to it. Because dawn to dusk is a container. It is not the contents. The statute tells you the shape of the jar. It says almost nothing about how much water is actually in it. And out here, in the long field beyond the churchyard, the answer is less than you think, and it sloshes. You walk out to the strips in the grey. The ground is cold through your shoes, and the shoes are not really shoes so much as an opinion about shoes. There is mist lying in the low part of the field like something that hasn't decided whether to leave. Your hands are already stiff, and the first thing that happens, the very first thing, is not work. It is a conversation. Somebody's brother has an opinion about the weather, and everybody has to hear the opinion, and then everybody has to have an opinion about the opinion, and this takes as long as it takes, because there is no one standing here with a stopwatch to inform you that the conversation is costing £4 a minute. Then you work. Genuinely you work. The kind of work that gets into the small of your back and stays there for a decade. Bending, hauling, the wrists, the shoulders, the same motion until the motion stops being a decision and becomes a weather system passing through your body. Nobody is pretending this is gentle. Your grandmother is bent like a question mark and she got that way honestly. And then you stop. Because it is breakfast. Not a coffee gulped standing at a counter while reading something that makes you unhappy. Breakfast. Sitting down in a field with bread that is mostly an argument in favour of teeth, and ale, and other people, and time. And then you work again, and then, in the middle of the morning, you stop again for what the customs call refreshment, which is a marvellous word because it admits, out loud, in the open, that a body is a thing that runs down and must be topped back up. Then lunch, then, and this is the part where the modern spine files a formal complaint, the nap. Not a stolen nap. Not a nap taken in a car park with the seat reclined and the phone face down out of shame. A customary afternoon nap. Customary. As in expected. As in the thing that is done. As in, if you skipped it, someone would look at you strangely and quietly wonder what was wrong with you. Which is precisely the reaction you would get today if you took one. The whole moral polarity of lying down in the middle of the day is reversed. You lie in the shade with your hat over your face and the sound of insects working harder than you are, and this is not a scandal. And it is not a personal failing, and nobody is going to mention it in your review because there is no review. Then you get up, and there is mid-afternoon refreshment, and then more work, and then dinner. And then the light goes long and gold and low, and the day, which the parchment insisted was 15 hours, has been quietly eaten from the inside by bread, ale, gossip, sleep, and the ordinary business of being an animal. Historians still argue whether those breaks were a genuine right, defended and demanded, or simply what always happens to warm bodies after bread and ale at midday, a custom that hardened into an entitlement only because nobody had yet invented the machinery to take it away. That's the trick of it, and it's worth sitting with. The day is not measured, it is spent. There is no clock on the wall of the sky. There is a task. Get the strip turned, get the hay in before the weather breaks, get the beasts moved, and the task has a shape, and the day stretches or shrinks around the shape like fabric over a frame. When the hay is ready and the sky is thinking about rain, you will work until you cannot see, and you will not stop. And nobody has to tell you, because you can smell the rain coming and so can everybody else. And when there is nothing urgent, the day sags in the middle and you sit down, and the sitting is not theft. Work and life do not have a wall between them, because nobody has built the wall yet. The conversation is part of the labour. The labour is where the conversation happens. You do not go to work and then come home and try to have a personality in the 90 minutes remaining. You're simply in your life all day, and some of your life involves a hoe. The quirky part, the part that makes the whole shape click into place, is that the pace is set by the slowest necessary thing, not by you, by the ox. The ox is a large, opinionated committee of one, and the ox has a speed, and that speed is the speed. You cannot optimize the ox. You cannot give the ox a productivity dashboard. The ox will walk at ox speed until the ox is finished, and you will walk beside it at ox speed. And this is one of the great forgotten mercies of the pre-industrial world. Your working day was governed by something that physically could not be made to hurry. Add it all up across a year. The sagging afternoons, the weather, the dark, the saints, the naps, and you land somewhere around 1,600 hours, which is fewer hours than the average American worked in 1987. When they were also, presumably, not permitted a nap, the light is still good, the bell hasn't gone, and down the lane, someone's pig has got into someone else's barley, and that, as it happens, is about to become a matter for the court. The pig is the whole problem, and the pig has no idea. The pig got through a gap in a hedge that somebody was supposed to have mended and did not mend. And the pig then did what a pig does when it finds itself standing in a field of somebody else's barley, which is to conduct a thorough and joyful survey. And now there are two men in the lane not quite shouting at each other, and a third man who has arrived to enjoy it. And by tomorrow the entire village will have an opinion, and within a few weeks this will be a matter of record. Because this goes to the court, not a court with columns and marble and a man in a wig looking down at you from a great height. The manor court, which meets in a hall, or a barn, or under a tree if the weather is behaving, and which is composed more or less of your neighbours. The men who will decide whether you owe a fine for the hedge are the same men you drink with, the same men whose fathers your father drank with, the same men who will be carrying your coffin in 20 years and will still, at that moment, be a little annoyed about the hedge. This is justice as neighbourhood theatre, and it is astonishing how much of it there is. A broken hedge, a pig where a pig should not be, a ditch not scoured, someone's cattle on the common when they had no right to be, someone's son who said something in the alehouse that he should not have said, and now must pay a small sum for having said it. Someone brewed ale and sold it, and the ale was, in the collective judgment of the village, a bit thin, and there is a fine for that too, and the fine is paid and everybody carries on, and the following year the same person brews the same thin ale, and pays the same small fine, until the fine stops being a punishment and becomes something closer to a subscription. You will notice what is missing. Nobody goes anywhere. There is no prison in this story. There is no criminal record that follows you into a background check. There is a fine, a few pence, a public accounting, and a slightly awkward walk home. The punishment is not exile. The punishment is that everyone knows, and everyone will keep knowing. And that is quite enough, thank you, because everyone knowing is a life sentence in a village of 200 souls. And here is the strange, tender thing about it. Being watched this closely is unbearable, and it is also load-bearing. The same neighbours who fine you for the hedge are the neighbours who will turn up when your roof goes. There is no way to have one without the other. The surveillance and the safety net are the same rope. Then there is the other kind of record, and this one will follow you into the dark. When someone dies suddenly, or strangely, or in a way that a village cannot simply absorb, the coroner comes, and the coroner and the sheriff summon a jury, from the ward where the death happened and from the wards nearby, and the jury is not the tidy 12 of your imagination, but anything from 12 to something approaching 50 people standing around in a lane being asked to agree about what happened. 50 witnesses, 50 pairs of eyes, 50 separate versions of the truth to be filed down into one, and the roll records everything, where the inquest sat, who the dead person was, what exactly occurred, the verdict, the names of the jurors, all of them, and the first finder, the person who found the body, are recorded by name because that matters, and alongside the first finder, the names of the pledges, the neighbours who stood up and vouched for him, who said with their own reputations that this man is who he says he is and will appear when called. Sit with that word for a second. Pledges. You find a body in a ditch on a Tuesday, and the system's first question is not who are you, but who will speak for you. And the answer is 4 men from your lane, and they give their names, and their names go on the parchment beside yours, and there they still are 700 years later, quietly guaranteeing you. The rolls are not gentle reading. A child drowned in a pan of milk. Not a river, not a well. A pan. A moment of ordinary domestic nothing. A woman turning to do one other thing. A world in which a household hazard is simply a fact of the floor. And a person buried under falling sand in a sandpit, which is the sort of death that has no story in it at all, no villain, no lesson, just the ground deciding. And these are written down in the same flat administrative hand as the fine for the hedge. Same ink, same formulas, same careful listing of who was present and who found what, and who vouched for whom. It reads as cold, and it is the opposite of cold. Nobody was obliged to write down that a child drowned in a pan of milk. There is no benefit in it, no purpose, no policy it serves. Somebody wrote it down anyway because a person had died and the death had a shape, and the shape was going to be recorded properly with names by neighbours in front of witnesses. That is bureaucratic tenderness. That is a village saying, this happened. And it happened here, and here is everyone who saw. Historians still argue whether all that watching was a kind of prison. Every hedge and every pig, and every death dragged out in front of 50 people who will remember it forever, or whether it was the only real insurance policy anyone had before insurance existed. There is even a case from 1396 about negligence. Someone did not do what someone should have done, and a court sat down and had to work out what that was worth. 7 centuries ago, the same argument, the same shrugging, exhausted attempt to price carelessness. The court will meet, the fine will be paid, the hedge will eventually get mended, but not this week, because tomorrow nobody is working at all. Nobody's working tomorrow because tomorrow belongs to a saint. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. Not a bank holiday voted through by a legislature after a decade of lobbying. Not a day you must apply for in advance in a system with a manager's approval and a note about coverage. A saint has a day, and the day is his, and on his day the plough stays where it is, and this is not a favour anyone is doing you. It's just what a Tuesday is now. And they add up. That's the thing about saints. There are a great many of them, and they are extremely well organised. So let's get the numbers out onto the table, because these are the numbers that launched 1,000 internet arguments, and you will meet them again later tonight, when we take them apart properly. Here they are, in the soft dark, unexamined for now. A 13th century English peasant, an adult man working the land, comes out at roughly 1,620 hours in a year. The average American in 1987 came out at 1,949. That is a gap of over 300 hours. That is more than 8 modern working weeks. That is, if you want to be unkind about it, an entire summer of your life, misled somewhere between the Black Death and the invention of the productivity app. By 2017, the American figure had drifted down to about 1,780, which sounds like progress until you notice that 700 years of engineering, electricity, machinery, and every labour-saving miracle ever devised have not yet managed to claw the number back down to where a man with an ox and a bad back had it. And the reason is not that the medieval day was short. We have already established that the medieval day was enormous, a great long sprawling summer thing, dawn to dusk, 15 or 16 hours of light, with a nap in the belly of it. The reason is the calendar. The days themselves were long and lazy, and there were vastly fewer of them. Holiday leisure in medieval England has been put at something like a third of the year. A third. Stop and let that land. One day in 3, off. Not off in the sense of lying on your sofa checking whether anyone has emailed you. Off in the sense that the work does not exist, that there is nowhere it can reach you from, that the field is simply not a thing that is happening today. And in the high-wage stretches, the years after the plague, when there were suddenly far more fields than there were hands to work them, and a labourer could look a landlord in the eye and name a price. The claim goes further still. In 14th century England, at those wages, a peasant might work no more than 150 days in a year. 150 days. You are doing the arithmetic. I can hear you doing the arithmetic. That is roughly 3 days a week. That is a man in a smock standing knee-deep in mud, with lice, accidentally inventing the 4-day week and then going one better out of sheer indifference. And it isn't only England. Across the Channel, under the old French monarchy, the calendar reads like an act of deliberate sabotage against the concept of work. 52 Sundays, then 90 days of rest on top of them, then 38 holidays on top of that. Add those together and see what's left. And Spain is where the story stops even pretending to be modest. Travellers went to Spain and came back reporting holidays that totalled something like 5 months of the year. 5 months. Whether the travellers were counting carefully or simply having a wonderful time and losing track is a question we will come back to, but somebody wrote it down, and people have been quoting it happily ever since. Now, breathe. Because this is the point in the evening where I have to be honest with you gently, in the way you tell someone their new haircut is interesting. These numbers are contested. Not fabricated. Contested. There are perfectly serious people who look at the 150 days and reach for a pencil and start asking uncomfortable questions. Which peasant? Which year? Which region? Does the year include the wife, who was working the entire time in a way the accounting quietly forgets? Does a holy day mean rest? Or does it mean church in the morning and the animals still needing feeding at dusk? Because animals have never heard of a saint and would not respect one if they had. Does dawn to dusk with a nap and 2 refreshment breaks belong in the same column as 8 hours at a desk? Are we comparing hours, or are we comparing 2 entirely different theories of what an hour is? And there is a wrinkle worth knowing, which is that the whole calculation was made in an argument. The figures come from a book written to rebut a very specific and very confident promise. The promise made in the 1930s and 40s that the machines were about to hand us all our lives back, that the future would be one long weekend, and that our great problem would be boredom. Well, the machines arrived, the weekend did not. So somebody went back through the centuries to find out where the leisure had gone, and came home with a medieval peasant in one hand and a stopwatch in the other, and the peasant was, in that argument, extremely useful. Historians still argue whether the 150 days is a genuine finding, a heavily qualified estimate that grew legs on the internet, or a well-aimed rhetorical stone thrown at a promise that was never kept. We will do the full autopsy later, I promise. We will lay the claim out on the table and go through it with a light and a small brush, and you may not like everything we find. But not now. Now the bell is going for a day that belongs to somebody who died 1,000 years ago, and was made a saint for it, and the whole village is walking towards the churchyard and somebody has been brewing for a week. Somebody has been brewing for a week, and the somebody is the church. This is the part that tends to break the modern brain, so let's take it slowly. The parish, the actual parish, the institution with the tower and the bells and the man in the vestments who tells you about your soul, needs money. The roof leaks. The roof always leaks. The roof has been leaking since before your grandmother was born and will still be leaking when your grandchildren are pretending to fix it. So the church brews ale and sells it, to you, in the churchyard. That is a church ale, and it is not a scandal. And nobody in the village finds it even slightly funny, and everybody today finds it hilarious. There is no fundraising committee. There is no silent auction. There is no gala. There is a large quantity of ale, and a village, and a roof that needs doing. And the arithmetic sorts itself out over the course of an afternoon, in a way that would horrify a modern diocesan finance officer and delight absolutely everybody else. And the ale is only the engine. What's built on top of it is the actual thing. Because at a church ale there are plays, real ones, put on by people who spend the rest of the year up to their shins in mud. Robin Hood, the outlaw, the man in the woods who takes from the powerful, performed on consecrated ground with the blessing of the institution, he would very much have robbed. And St. George, the dragon, the whole spectacle, the beast made of somebody's uncle and a quantity of painted cloth, roaring at children who scream, with the specific joy of being frightened by something they know is only what from up the lane. There is dancing until the light goes. Later in the period, the Morris dancers arrive with the bells and the handkerchiefs, and one has to say, in fairness, that they have not changed a great deal, and neither has the reaction of the average bystander, and there is a king and a queen elected. That's the tidbit that ought to keep you awake, except that you're meant to be falling asleep, so let it be a soft one. The village chooses a king and a queen to preside over the revel, a crown, for a day, given by acclaim to somebody who was mucking out a byre on Thursday. In a world with an actual king, an actual anointed hierarchy, an entire cosmology of who is above whom, the village cheerfully elects a monarch of its own for the afternoon, sits him at the head of things, and obeys him about as much as anyone ever obeys a king made of laughter. And then Monday comes, and the crown goes back in the box, and he's mucking out the byre again. They come thick these days. May Day, when the whole village goes out to meet the summer, as if the summer were a visitor who might be offended if nobody turned up. Ascension Day, which arrives on the Thursday after Rogation Sunday, and which anyone with an eye for logistics will note is a Thursday, which is a magnificent thing for a holy day to be. And Whit Sunday, 10 days after Ascension, which is one of the great days for an ale, and which lands in the part of the year when the evenings have gone long and generous, and nobody has any intention of going home. And then there is the great one, Corpus Christi, a feast day from 1311, arriving in England from 1318 and running until 1548, which is a shade under 2.5 centuries of a country stopping dead in early summer. It floats, it has no fixed square on the calendar, because it hangs off Easter and Easter wanders, so Corpus Christi comes to rest somewhere between the 21st of May and the 23rd of June, depending on what the moon and the mathematics have decided that year. You do not know precisely when your biggest festival is until someone works it out. It is a holiday that moves. It is a holiday you have to catch. And in York they made something extraordinary out of it. The plays. The Corpus Christi plays at York, which ran for something like 200 years. The whole story, the entire arc of everything, from the beginning of the world to the end of it, staged in the street in pieces by the guilds of the city, the tradesmen, the people who made things for a living, spending their own money, on their own wagons, to put on the largest piece of theatre their world could imagine. 200 years. Think about what that means. A man plays a part, his son watches from the crowd, his grandson plays the part, and the thing keeps going, generation after generation, until the play is older than every single person watching it and older than most of the buildings it rolls past, and then it stops. Because the 16th century arrives, and the Reformation arrives with it, and the plays are suppressed. The feast itself is abolished in 1548. The wagons stop. The dragon goes into somebody's barn and is not taken out again. 200 years of a city's collective imagination ended by administration. Historians still argue whether the killing of the plays and the ales was really about theology at all, about the doctrine and the images and the sincerity of the thing, or whether it was simply the first great clearing of the calendar, the opening move in a much longer campaign to get people out of the churchyard and back into the field. Because notice what an ale actually is, underneath the dragon and the dancing and the elected king. It is a day when the entire village is in one place, doing nothing productive, drinking beer sold to them by God, and enjoying it enormously. From a certain angle, a cold, tidy, forward-looking angle, that is a lot of daylight going to waste. And there will come a time when somebody with an eye for daylight looks at all of it and starts, very reasonably, very quietly, to tidy it away. But that's centuries off. Tonight the fire is lit, the dragon has been put away for another year, and there is still ale left, and the ale has to go somewhere. The ale goes where the ale always goes, which is into a low room with a bad roof and a good fire, and so do you. There is no sign outside. There is no name. There is no menu chalked on a board. No atmosphere carefully designed by somebody in a city to evoke exactly this room. 700 years later, at 4 times the price, there is a house. Somebody in that house has brewed. A bush or a pole has been stuck out over the door to say so, and that is the entire marketing strategy. And it works flawlessly because everybody within 2 miles already knew on Tuesday. You duck under the lintel. Everyone ducks. The lintel has been quietly assaulting foreheads for generations and shows no remorse. and the first thing that hits you is the heat. The second thing is the smoke. There is a fire, and there is, in a loose and optimistic sense, somewhere for the smoke to go, and the smoke has considered the offer and declined. It hangs in a flat blue layer at about head height, and slowly, patiently, kippers everybody in the room. You will smell of this tomorrow, you will smell of this next week. Everyone you know smells of it too, so nobody has ever mentioned it, in the entire history of the village. And then the noise, not music, not yet, not necessarily. Just the noise of 30 people who have known each other since birth, all talking at once at volume about nothing. Now, the ale. And I want to be careful here, because this is the point where the modern brain reaches for a joke it doesn't need. The ale is not recreation, or rather, it is not only recreation. The ale is food. It is calories in liquid form, brewed weak enough that you can drink it all day and still stand up, thick enough that it counts as a meal, and it is one of the ways a body that spends 15 hours in a wet field manages to keep the fire lit. When they hand it to you at breakfast in the field at mid-morning refreshment, they are not offering you a drink. They are handing you lunch, in advance, in a cup. The whole civilization runs on it in the way yours runs on coffee, except with rather more grace about the matter and considerably better naps. So sit. There's a bench. The bench is a plank and an opinion, and by the end of the evening your spine will have made its feelings known. Look around and understand what this room actually is, because it is doing about 9 jobs at once and none of them are on the sign, chiefly because there is no sign, it is the newspaper. Everything that happens here first, and by the time it has crossed the room twice it has improved considerably. Whose you is lambing, who is dying, who is not dying as much as they claim. What the price of things is at the market 2 valleys over, which nobody here can verify and everybody here will repeat as fact for the next decade. It is the labour exchange. If you need a pair of hands next week, you do not post a notice. You come here and you buy a man an ale and you mention it sideways, and it is arranged. And nothing is written down, and it holds because the whole thing is held together by the fact that everybody here will still be here in 30 years and remembers everything. It is the bank, more or less. Small debts, small favours, small credits, all of them tracked in a shared communal memory more accurate and considerably more merciless than any ledger. It is the courtroom's waiting room and its appeal court both. Half the quarrels that will end up in front of the manor court start here at about the 4th cup, and the other half, the ones that never reach the court at all, are settled here too at about the 6th, when 2 men who have been circling each other for a month finally say the thing out loud, and somebody's uncle says something that makes them both laugh, and that is the end of it, forever. And it is the heat, which matters more than any of the rest of it, honestly. Your house is cold. Your house has been cold since October, and will be cold until the world decides otherwise. This room is warm, and warmth is not free. It costs wood, it costs somebody's labour, and so warmth, out here, is a thing you gather around, in company or not at all. You cannot be warm alone. You can only be warm together. The whole architecture of the evening comes out of that one physical fact, and it explains almost everything about why the room is full, which is the part I think gets missed when people picture this. The medieval peasant is not going out for a drink. The concept doesn't quite exist. There is no wall between the work and the life that you'd have to climb over to get here. The talking and the labouring and the drinking and the arranging and the arguing are all the same continuous substance, and this room is simply where that substance is warmest. Historians still argue whether the alehouse was genuinely the beating heart of village life, the place where the community was made and remade every evening, or whether that's a warm story we tell because the alternative is admitting we've built a world where the only place left to go after work is home. And there is one more thing about this room that you should know before the fire dies down. It is dangerous, mildly, cheerfully, in the way that a room full of tired, warm, well-fed people with strong opinions and no referee is always mildly dangerous. Somebody says something. Somebody else stands up. Nothing terrible happens, 99 evenings in 100, but there is a reason the king's men keep taking an interest in what villagers get up to when they're enjoying themselves. There is a reason that in 1314 someone thought it worth the trouble of a royal proclamation to stop Londoners playing a game with a ball. We should probably talk about the ball. You step out of the alehouse doorway into the blue end of the evening, and the cold lifts the ale warmth off your cheeks in about the time it takes to fasten your cloak, and somewhere behind you a voice says the one word that empties a room faster than a rumour of free bread. Ball. There is always a voice. It has been building since the second cup, patient as yeast. And now the light is long and soft and generous, and the ground is churned and forgiving, and tomorrow, as it happens, belongs to nobody, because the parish decided some centuries ago that tomorrow belongs to a saint. So the suggestion hardens into a plan. Word goes down the lane the way water goes downhill. Boys are sent to fetch other boys, and the ball comes out from wherever the ball lives, and it is not a ball as you understand a ball. It is a bladder in a leather coat. It is lumpy and slightly damp and heavier than it has any right to be, and it has firm private opinions about which direction it intends to roll. There is no pitch. That is the first thing to understand. There is no line, no touch, no whistle, no man in black holding up a card, no groundsman weeping over the turf. There is a village at one end and a village at the other, or a parish and a parish, or simply everyone who felt like it split, roughly in half by somebody's cousin. The goals, if you can dignify them with the word, are landmarks, a church door, a mill, a tree that everybody agrees on, and they are not near each other. They are a walk apart, they are a conversation apart. Between them lies every ditch, hedge, stream, bramble, and startled sheep in the district, and all of it is in play, because nothing has been declared out. You take your place in the crowd, which is not a formation so much as a weather system, and when the ball goes up, the crowd goes with it, and you go with the crowd, because the alternative is being where the crowd used to be, and that is a very poor place to stand. It is enormous fun. Your lungs burn, your feet are wet within a minute, someone's elbow finds your ribs and someone else's shoulder finds your back, and you come up out of the mud laughing so hard you cannot get a breath, and it is genuinely one of the best hours of your year. It is also why kings kept trying to make it illegal. In 1314, Edward II issued a proclamation banning football in London, and here is the detail worth holding. The stated reason was to preserve the peace. Not that the game was frivolous, not that it wasted the working day, not that it was beneath the dignity of a subject of the crown. To preserve the peace. That is not sports policy, that is the language you use about crowds. Somewhere in a chamber in London, a man who had never kicked anything in his life read a report about what football was doing to his capital and reached, with a sigh for the word peace, and you can feel the sigh across 700 years. You know how we know the rest? The coroner's rolls. The coroner's job was to record every sudden and unnatural death, the suicides, the accidents, the homicides, the unclassifiable. The coroner and the sheriffs would summon an investigative jury drawn from the ward where the death happened, and from the wards next door, and that jury could be 12 men, or it could be something like 50, depending on how interesting the death was and how many people wanted a look. The record notes the place of the inquest, the name of the dead, the circumstances, the verdict, every juror's name, and, this is my favourite bureaucratic wrinkle in the whole medieval world, the name of the first finder plus the pledges who vouched for him. The first finder is the person who found the body, and finding a body did not make you a good citizen who had done a helpful thing. It made you, briefly, an administrative problem. A man who needed neighbours to stand up and swear that he was the sort of person who merely finds bodies rather than the sort who produces them. Your reward for civic duty was needing character references, and football walked straight into those roles, not as a curiosity, as a regular. Historians still argue whether medieval football is best understood as a sport with catastrophically poor safety standards, or as a licensed brawl that happened to have a ball in the middle of it, as an excuse, and the honest answer is that the people playing it would not have recognised the distinction, and might have been offended that you asked, because the village knew exactly what it was doing. On some saints' days and holy days, villages arranged fights, not spontaneous fights, arranged ones, as entertainment, scheduled, on the calendar in daylight with spectators. Sit with that for a moment, in the dark, warm, with your eyes closed. The village had noticed that people who lived pressed together their whole lives, sharing a field and a well and a grudge that started before either of them was born, accumulate something. And rather than pretend the something wasn't there, and rather than let it come out in January in a doorway with no witnesses, they gave it a date. They put it next to a saint. They said, not now, not now, not now, and then, on a bright day with everyone watching and everyone sober enough to stop it now, hostility with a release valve, and the valve had an opening time. It is barbaric, and it is also, if you tilt your head, an astonishingly practical piece of emotional engineering, which is more than can be said for most of what we do with our grudges, which is nothing forever at 3 in the morning. And now, with the mud on you and the game breaking up and the light nearly gone, you can go back to where all this started. Norfolk, 1321. Shudham Priory. A canon named William de Spalding was playing a ball game. Just this. Just an evening like the one you're standing in. He kicked the ball, and a friend of his, a layman, also called William, because the 14th century had roughly 6 names and used them all at once, came running against him and was wounded on the cannon's sheathed knife. Sheathed. It was in its sheath, on his belt, the way your keys are in your pocket. He was not holding it. He was not brandishing it. He had simply gone out to play, wearing what a man wore. The friend died 6 days later. De Spalding was suspended from every clerical duty he had. He appealed to Pope John the 22nd, who granted him a dispensation in 1321. No blame attached. And the reasoning is the part that has stayed with me all this way, the part I have been carrying since before you knew his name. The dispensation notes that the canon felt the death deeply, and that he feared what his enemies might say. He feared what his enemies might say, not damnation, not the law, the parish, the talk, the men who would lean on a fence and shape it into something. That is the man you met at the beginning. Now you know what he was doing that day. He was playing football on soft ground in the fading light, laughing probably, right up until he wasn't. And that is the thing about the parish, isn't it? The talk, the fence, the men leaning on it, because the same village that carried you would also, given the chance, hold you up to the light and turn you slowly and describe what it saw to everyone who asked and several who didn't. Those are not 2 villages. That is 1 village, and it is the same machinery doing both jobs, and you cannot have the first without the second. And if you take nothing else from this long soft evening, take that. Start with the carrying, because the carrying is real and it is worth your attention. You do not own a plough. Almost nobody owns a plough. A plough is an absurd object. Heavy, expensive, temperamental, and useless without a team. Of beasts in front of it that you also do not own. So the plough is shared, and the beasts are pooled. And the arrangement by which they are shared is older than anyone's memory of it, and is defended with a vigour that would surprise you. Your neighbour's ox and your neighbour's neighbour's ox and one animal of ambiguous parentage belonging to a widow at the end of the lane all walk out together. And the field gets turned, and it gets turned for everyone, and if you had to do it alone you would simply not eat. You do not have an oven either. Bread wants heat that a domestic fire cannot honestly give, sustained, contained, for long enough, and so the baking is done where the oven is, and the oven is somewhere else, and everybody's dough goes to the same warm mouth in the same order it has gone for generations, which means everybody in the village knows what everybody in the village is having for dinner, not approximately, precisely, by weight. Your household's fortunes, its thrift, its little pretensions, all of it turns up in a basket at a communal. Doran is read at a glance by a woman who has been reading baskets for 40 years and has never once been wrong. There are guilds, too, the associations that put a hand under people when the ground went out from under them. Someone dies and the funeral gets paid for. Someone's roof goes and the roof gets fixed. Someone's cow goes and there is mysteriously another cow. Not charity exactly. Something older and more binding than charity. An understanding that misfortune is a thing that rotates, and that today it is you standing in the wet looking at a hole in your thatch, and next spring it will be him. And the arithmetic works out over a lifetime as long as nobody starts keeping a separate private ledger. And it goes all the way into the law. Remember the coroner's roll and the first finder, the person who stumbled on a body and then needed pledges, needed neighbours, to stand up and vouch for him. That is not an accident of paperwork. That is the whole world view in one line of an inquest record. The system did not primarily ask what did the evidence show. It asked who will stand for this man. Your innocence was, in a real and practical sense, a thing your neighbours held on your behalf, which is beautiful, and which also means your innocence was only ever as good as your last 4 decades of behaviour at the oven. You are never alone, not once, not for an hour. Think about your day and count the moments. You wake in a room with other people in it, some of whom are related to you and some of whom you have simply always known. You work a field within sight of a dozen others who could tell you without straining exactly how far behind you are on your strip and precisely why. You eat where you can be seen. You argue where you can be heard. You go to church and stand shoulder to shoulder with the entire cast of your life. You drink with them. You play football against them and get an elbow in the ribs from a man who will be at your funeral. You sleep and the people you sleep near can hear you breathing and you can hear them. There is no door in your life that closes on you alone. There is no version of you that exists unwitnessed. And here is the honest part, the part I'm not going to smooth over for you at this hour. That is a comfort and it is also a horror, and they are the same fact wearing two coats. The comfort is enormous, really. You will never lie awake at 3 a.m. wondering whether anyone would notice if you simply stopped, because they would notice by breakfast. And by mid-morning there would be a small delegation at your door, and by evening someone's aunt would be in your house doing something practical and slightly bossy with a pot. Your grief is not private, which means it is not yours to carry alone. Your madness is not private, which means the village absorbs it as weather. You will be looked after, because being looked after is not a service you qualify for. It is simply what happens to a person standing in that particular field. Nobody is going to fall through, because there is no through. It is all net. The horror is the identical sentence read at a different hour. You will never lie awake wondering whether anyone would notice. They would notice everything. They notice everything now. They noticed the basket. They noticed the argument. They noticed who your daughter walked home with and what you said about the priest and the fact that you have been odd since the winter. There is no reinvention here. There is no leaving and coming back different. Your reputation was made when you were 9, and it will be adjusted only at the margins for the rest of your life. And it will follow your children, and it will attend your funeral and stand at the back with its arms folded. You cannot be someone else. There is nowhere to be someone else at. Historians still argue whether the medieval village is better described as a community of mutual support or a system of total mutual surveillance, and I would gently suggest that the argument is a category error. Because it was one apparatus, it ran both programs at once, and it never occurred to anyone living inside it that these were separable things. Modern loneliness is a specific ache, and it is real, and I am not going to be glib about it at bedtime. But it is worth noticing what we traded for it. We bought the closed door, we bought the ability to be unaccounted for on a Tuesday, and the price was that if you go quiet, you can go quiet for a very long time before a basket arrives. They had no privacy and no exit. You have a lock and a lease and a name you can change. Neither of those is freedom. Both of them are just the shape the walls take. Hold that thought and hold it lightly, because we are about to do something almost indecent. We are about to walk into one specific village in the mountains 700 years ago and listen to it talk. Its beds, its gossip, its grudges, its hair being combed for lice by firelight. And we can do it. We can hear every word of it for one reason, and it is not a good reason. The reason is that an inquisitor wrote it down. The village is called Montaigu. It sits high in the Ariège, in the Pyrenees on the French side, in country where the wind has opinions and the winter has authority. It is small, it is poor. It is the kind of place that history normally drives straight past without slowing. Because history, as a rule, only writes down people who own things or kill people who own things. We know Montaigu anyway. We know it better than we know most towns of 100,000 souls. We know who slept in which bed and who was in it with them. We know who owed what and who resented whom, and who was thought to be lazy and who was thought to be soft in the head, and who kept the good cheese back. We know how they talked to each other in doorways. We know how they combed each other's hair for lice by the fire in the evenings, one head in another's lap, patient, unhurried, hour after hour, which was, incidentally, one of the great social technologies of the place, because delousing takes a long time and your hands are busy and your mouth isn't. And the entire information economy of a mountain village ran on that. If you want to know where gossip lives, it lives in someone's fingers going carefully through someone else's hair. It is intimate and it is tender, and it is absolutely a listening post. We know the shape of their days, we know what they thought happened after you died, not what the church told them, what they actually thought, muttered on a hillside, half heretical, half invented, entirely their own. And we know all of it because between 1318 and 1324, a man sat in a room and asked them questions, and they answered, because the alternative to answering was worse. His name was Jacques Fournier. He was Bishop of Pamiers. He would later become Pope Benedict XII, which tells you something about how this work was regarded by his employers. He was conducting an inquisition into heresy, hunting the last of the Cathars in the mountains, and he was extraordinarily, hideously good at it, because here is what made him dangerous. He was not a brute you can survive in a sense. A brute wants a confession, and will take any confession, and a clever peasant can hand him one and go home. Fournier did not want any confession. He wanted the true one. He was an acute psychologist. He was pitiless. He was meticulous. He listened. He let people talk and talk and talk, past the point where they were being careful, and then he asked the small, quiet follow-up question, about a detail they had mentioned 40 minutes earlier and forgotten they had mentioned, and he wrote down the answer. He wanted the beds. He wanted the lice. He wanted to know who was at the fire and what was said, and in what order, and who left the room, and what they were wearing, and how they seemed. Not because he was curious about peasant life, because heresy hides in the details, and a man who can tell you the texture of an evening cannot easily invent one. So he took the texture, all of it, and it went into a register, in Latin in order, and the register survived. And so, 650 years later, a French historian opened that register and did something nobody had quite done before. He read it not as a record of heresy, but as a record of a village. Every interrogation read against the grain, every terrified digression treated as evidence, not of guilt but of life. He wrote a book about it in the mid-70s and called it After the Village, with a subtitle about the promised land of error. And it did what almost nothing in medieval history had done. It made 100 dead peasants into people with faces. The book maps their behaviour, their numbers, how they thought, what they believed the universe was made of, and what shape they thought it had. The daily life of the village, and the daily life of the mountain pastures above it, which is where we are going next, and which is where this story has its heart. And you cannot get away from where it came from. Every warm human detail in that book, every joke recorded, every insult, every moment of gentleness between two people in a cold house, reached us through a man who was collecting it in order to destroy them. That is the trade. We have the village because the village was prosecuted. If Montaigu had been left alone, Montaigu would be a name on a map and a few stones. Historians still argue whether we can trust a word of it, whether testimony given to an inquisitor is a window into a village or a mirror showing the inquisitor his own face, whether these people are talking or performing, whether fear rewrites a memory before it reaches the mouth. Both things are true at once, and the honest reader holds both and reads on anyway, because it is all we have, and it is so much more than we have anywhere else. Now, if you want to understand how the two halves of the last section fit together, the net and the noose, the comfort and the horror, you need to meet the curé. His name was Pierre Clergue, and he was the priest of Montaigu, and he ran it. He was brutal. He was powerful, in the way a man can be powerful in a place with 100 people in it, which is a much more total kind of power than being powerful in a city. Because in a city you can walk away from a man, and in Montaigu you cannot walk anywhere he isn't. He had the parish. He had the family behind him. He had the confessional, which is to say he had the inside of everybody's head, filed alphabetically. And he had appetites, and he indulged them, and the village knew, and the villagers knowing changed nothing at all, which is the most instructive detail in the whole story. And when the Inquisitor came up the mountain, Pierre Clergue did the arithmetic that men like Pierre Clergue have always done. He handed over his enemies, not heretics, enemies. The distinction was available to him, and he declined it. The people he disliked, the people who had crossed his family, the people whose land was inconveniently placed, the people who'd said the wrong thing about him at the wrong fire, they went into the register. He fed a machine that burned people, and he used it to settle village business, the kind of business that in a fairer world gets settled by two men not speaking at a wedding. That is what happens when you take a place where everyone knows everything about everyone, and hand one man with a grudge a direct line to an authority that can end lives. The net becomes a net in the other sense. All that intimacy, the hair, the fire, the long unhurried evenings, turns out to be a database, and somebody had the keys. So hold your comfort and your horror together, and remember that they were never separate, and that in Montaigu it took one ambitious priest and one patient bishop, about 6 years to convert the whole warm apparatus of village life into a list of names. But there was one man in that village who was harder to hold, and he is the reason I wanted to bring you up this mountain at all. He was a shepherd, and his name was Pierre Maury. Everything I have told you so far about the medieval world has been about being held in place. The strip in the field, the bell, the oven, the court, the neighbours who can tell you the weight of your dough. A whole life lived inside a circle you could walk across in 20 minutes, watched from every angle, from birth to the churchyard, no exit. Pierre Maury walked out of that circle every year of his life and came back when he felt like it. That is what a shepherd was. Not a man with a crook standing picturesquely on a slope in a stained glass window. A man who moved. The flocks went up in the warm months, and down in the cold ones, up to the high pastures and back down to the winter grazing, and the man went with them, over passes, across borders, into Spain and out of Spain for weeks, for months, for years. A life measured not in field strips but in distances, not in the parish bell but in weather and grass and the condition of a flock's feet. Think about what that does to a person. He wakes where he stopped. The task is not sunrise to sunset digging in a shape somebody else assigned him. The task is keep them alive, keep them moving, keep them fed, and the day arranges itself around that and around nothing else. No bailiff on the ridge, no jury of the ward, no priest counting who came to mass. Above him there is simply an enormous quantity of sky, more sky than a man in a village sees in his life, sky that goes on being there whether or not he has an opinion about it, and around him, quiet. Real quiet. The kind of quiet that a person in a house with 8 people in it has genuinely never heard. He knew other shepherds, in the way that people who move know each other. A network stretched across mountains, meeting at the same pastures, wintering in the same valleys, carrying news the way a river carries silt. And he made friends among the perfecti, the holy men of the old faith the church was hunting off the map, and he sheltered them, and he moved with them, and he talked with them on the high slopes where nobody could hear. And by every account he was a fatalist, not a gloomy one, not a man dragging his own funeral around behind him. Something quieter and rarer than that. A man who had decided, apparently early and apparently for good, that things would go how they would go, that the flock would live or it wouldn't, that the winter would be hard or it wouldn't, that the men who wanted to burn his friends would find them or they wouldn't. He seems to have held his own life the way you hold a bird, attentively but with an open hand. And I want to be careful here, because it would be so easy to make him a poster. Free man of the mountains. No boss, no bell, no clock, just him and the sky and a philosophy. You can practically see the merchandise. But it is worth saying plainly what he actually had, because he had the thing this entire long night has been circling. He had a life that was not measured against anything he could fail. There was no target. There was no quota. There was no ledger in which Pierre Maury was behind. There was a flock, and there was terrain, and there was weather, and none of those things were disappointed in him. Weather does not think you are underperforming. Mountain has never once wondered why you haven't done more with your potential. Historians still argue whether Pierre Maury's fatalism was a genuine philosophy he arrived at, or a survival posture that a hunted man adopts because the alternative is going mad, or simply the ordinary common sense of anyone, whose livelihood depends on things that do not care about him, and you can pick whichever you like. I don't think he'd mind. I don't think he'd have taken much interest in the question, honestly, which may itself be the answer. Quirky and a little marvellous when you sit with it. Of all the people in that village, the one who lived closest to what we would now sell as wellness, the walking, the sky, the animals, the silence, the deliberate lightness of grip, was a semi-literate shepherd who was technically a fugitive. He went to Spain, he came back. That is the sentence. He came back. He didn't have to. That is the part I cannot put down. He was the one person in this whole story with an exit, an actual working exit. The only man on this mountain who could have simply kept walking and become nobody's problem forever. He had the legs, he had the trade, he had the network. He had a border he'd crossed so many times it was less a border than a commute. He could have vanished into Catalonia and grown old with a flock, and died in the sun with nobody writing anything down. He came back, because his people were here, his friends, the pastures he knew, the valleys where he understood exactly which grass came up when. Because being nobody somewhere else is not actually freedom. It is just absence, and absence gets cold, because the same net that strangles is the net that holds, and he had been raised in it, and it had his heart, and he came back up the passes into the country where the Inquisitor was working, and he disappeared into the Inquisitor's prison. That's it. That is where the register stops carrying him. The man who moved for a living, who wintered in one kingdom and summered in another, who owned nothing you could confiscate and belonged to no field, put in a room and kept there. I have been turning that over the whole time I've been telling you this. The most free man in the story. The lightest hands, the widest sky, the least to lose, and it did not save him. Not 1 hour of it. All that walking, all that weather, all that hard-earned open-handedness in the face of a universe that owed him nothing. And the machine came up the mountain anyway, and it had his name, because a priest with a grudge in a village of 100 people had written it down. Freedom is not a personality, it is not a practice, it is not something you can achieve inwardly, and then carry through a door that locks behind you. Pierre Maury had, by any measure we would recognise, the healthiest relationship with time of anyone we have met tonight, and it did not matter, because the world had other machinery, and that machinery was not interested in his relationship with time. So we should not romanticize him, and I have probably already failed, and I am at peace with that at this hour. But keep him. Keep the picture of him on a high slope in the warm months, with the flock spread out below him like spilled cloud, and the sky doing the enormous thing it does, and nothing in the world expecting him to have finished anything, by any particular hour of any particular day, because we have been standing on the pleasant side of the ledger for a long time now. The ale, the plays, the football, the saints' days, the shepherd on his mountain. It is time to turn the page over, because there is another side to it, and if I only gave you the first side I would be lying to you, softly, in a nice voice, at a vulnerable hour, which is the worst way to be lied to, so let's turn it over, gently. Nothing here is going to be ugly, and I am not going to make you look at anything you don't want to look at in the dark. But it needs saying, and it needs saying properly, because the whole argument of this long night collapses into nonsense if we don't. Here is the thing about all that lovely unhurried time. They were hungry. Not hungry the way you are hungry at 4 PM, when the meeting is running long and you become an unreliable narrator of your own emotions. Hungry as a permanent background condition of being alive. Hungry as architecture. Hunger was not an event that happened to medieval people. It was the room they lived in, and everything else. The plays, the ales, the football, the saints' days, the long, soft evenings by the fire with someone's hands in your hair. All of it happened inside that room, in the intervals when the room was quiet. Consider what the year actually was. The whole apparatus, the shared plough, the ox pooled from 3 households, the strips, the boon work, the tithe, the bailiff, the court, the calendar of the saints. The entire beautiful communal machine existed for one purpose: getting enough grain out of the ground to reach next year. That's it. That's the project. Everything else is decoration on the side of a building whose only function is not starving, and the machine had no slack in it. None. A wet spring, a cold summer, a fortnight of rain at the wrong point in August, a cattle sickness moving through the district, and the arithmetic that was already tight becomes arithmetic that does not work. There is no buffer. There is no other supplier. There is no second harvest arriving by lorry from a warmer country. There is the field, and there is the sky is not taking requests, which incidentally recasts something we breezed past earlier. Remember the English Act of 1495, setting the labourer's day at sunrise to sunset in winter, and in summer from 5 AM to 8 PM. I let you hear that as a statute about greed, and partly it was. But look at when the long day falls, summer, harvest. The one window in the entire year when the difference between working until 8 and working until 6 is the difference between a village that eats in February and a village that doesn't. That 15-hour day was not only somebody being grasping, it was also a whole society pressing its thumb down hard on the only weeks that counted, because it knew exactly what January looks like when you get it wrong. And when the grain went bad, the grain could go bad in a way that did more than leave you empty. There is a thing that grows on rye, a small dark passenger, easy to miss, easy to grind up with everything else. And when it goes into the bread, it makes people ill in ways that a village had no framework for at all. Sickness that came out of the loaf, the one thing you had, the thing you had worked all year and prayed all year for, the thing that meant survival, turning quietly against the people eating it. They gave it names and they gave it saints and they built hospitals for it, because that is what you do when you cannot explain a thing, but you can still sit with the people it is happening to. Historians still argue whether medieval hunger is best understood as chronic, a permanent low grinding shortfall that everybody carried in their bones their whole lives, or episodic, a matter of ordinary sufficiency in most years punctuated by catastrophes that arrived like weather. And the answer probably varies by valley, by decade. By whether your lord was a person or an institution, and by whether it rained. But notice that both answers are answers to the question how bad, not whether. And then there is the part I have to tell you carefully. The children. They died. Enough of them that a family was not a fixed thing you could count on. Enough that you did not necessarily name a child immediately, and enough that a woman might bear many and raise few, and enough that the parish knew. A particular kind of quiet very well. We know this in the way we know most of it, from the records, from the same patient clerks with the same terrible handwriting. The coroner's rolls are full of the accidents of small people in a world built entirely without them in mind. A child buried under falling sand in a sandpit. A child drowned in a pan of milk. Read that last one twice. A pan of milk. A container of nourishment, the most benign object in a medieval house. sitting on a floor where a small person was crawling, and a clerk somewhere writing it down in Latin because the law required an inquest even for that. Even then, even there. A jury summoned, neighbours standing in a doorway, a verdict recorded, a name entered, the paperwork of an unbearable Tuesday. That is what no exit means. It doesn't mean you can't leave the village. It means there is nowhere to take the child. There is no ward, no drip, no antibiotic, no ambulance, no number to call it to in the morning, no second opinion. There is a wise woman and a prayer and the parish. And the parish is doing absolutely everything it can, and everything it can is not enough. And everybody understands that and nobody says it. So when we get to the end of tonight and I ask you to weigh all this up, I want you holding both sides in your two hands at once. On one side, a life with fewer working hours than yours, and a third of the year given over to holy days, and a day shaped by tasks instead of a clock, and evenings that went on, and a village that would never once let you disappear. On the other, this. Hunger as a structural fact, bread that could betray you, children who did not come through, and no exit, not from the village, not from the field, not from the year, not from any of it. They were not less stressed because they had found some secret. They were less stressed, if they were, about one particular thing, the modern sensation of being behind, of failing a number, of a clock you can disappoint. They had other things instead. They had February, and they knew it was coming every year, from the moment the lights started going, which is perhaps why they made such an enormous fuss on the days when it wasn't. And then the famine loosens its grip, the way weather does, without apology and without explanation, and the harvests come back and the barns fill. And the children who are hungry for those long grey years grow up with a certain carefulness around bread that never entirely leaves them. The village exhales, it buries what it has to bury, it mends what it lets slide, it goes back to the strips and the sheep, and the long, soft, unwinnable argument with the soil. And it assumes, because people always assume this in every century and you do it too, lying there in the warm dark thinking the hard part is behind you, that it has already met the worst thing that will ever happen to it. It has not. The thing that comes next arrives the way everything arrives in your world, through the market. Not on a proclamation, not from the pulpit, not carried in by a herald with a good voice and a clean tabard. It comes as talk. A carter mentions a town he no longer goes to. A woolman says the road south is quiet in a way roads are not supposed to be quiet. Somebody's cousin's parish has stopped sending anyone to the fair, and the rumour moves faster than the thing itself, which is the one small mercy on offer, because for a few weeks you get to stand in your own doorway, in the ordinary evening light, and feel the ordinariness of it, and not yet know what that evening is worth. Then it reaches you. I am not going to walk you through it. You are trying to sleep, and there is nothing in it that you need. It is enough to say that the bells change. That is the part the records keep coming back to, and it is the part that gets under the ribs. You have spent your whole life inside a soundscape of bells. Bells for waking, bells for work, bells for the hours, bells that tell you when to stop and when to kneel, and when to come in from the field, and now the bell that marks a death starts ringing at the wrong frequency. Too often. Then too often to bother. Then it stops meaning anything at all, because a signal that never stops is no longer a signal. It is just weather. Your entire system of time is built out of bells, and the bells are the first thing that breaks. And then, eventually it passes, and you come out. Here is the strange, cold thing about what you find on the other side. The fields are still there. The soil does not catch anything. The oxen are fine. The mill is fine. The manor house is exactly as smug as it was. Everything that makes wealth is still standing in the same place it was standing before, and the only thing that is missing, on a scale nobody in living memory has words for, is people. Which means, and it takes a little while for anyone to say this out loud, because it feels obscene to notice it, that for the first time in the memory of anyone alive, the people who are left are scarce. You're scarce. Your hands are scarce. That back of yours, that you have been renting out to the Lord's fields since you were tall enough to hold a hook, has just become the rarest commodity in England, and a man who has something rare eventually works out that he can ask for more of it. So they do. Wages rise, not politely. Men who have spent generations accepting whatever the Lord Steward said the rate would start doing something genuinely revolutionary, which is walking. Just walking. Down the road to the next manor where somebody is standing in a half-cut field with a look of rising panic, willing to pay double and not ask too many questions about whose villain you technically are. Labour discovers, more or less by accident, that it has legs. And the response from the top of the pile is the oldest response in recorded history. In 1351 there is a statute of labourers, and it does exactly what you would expect a frightened landowning class to do when it cannot afford the going rate. It makes the going rate illegal. Wages are capped at the old levels, as though the world had not just been rearranged. Work is not optional, if you are able. And you're asked, you take it, at the price they name. It is a law that says, with a completely straight face, that supply and demand is a rule for other people. Somewhere a scribe wrote all of that down neatly and went to bed feeling that a serious problem had been managed. It did not work very well, which is its own small comfort. You cannot legislate a third of Europe back into existence. And this is the hinge, and I want you to hold it while you drift, is where the lovely number comes from. The one you have heard. The peasant who worked 150 days a year. The golden age of the well-paid, half-idle, gloriously unbothered medieval labourer with his third of the year in holidays and his long afternoons. That number, when people reach for it, is reaching for exactly this moment. The high-wage 14th century, the years when a working man could name his price, the good times are the aftermath. The leisure is the space left by the dead. Every extra day off in that arithmetic is standing in somebody's empty place. And you knew them, and there is no version of this where you get the day and they get to keep the field. Historians still argue whether that golden age was ever really a golden age. How long it lasted, how many it touched, whether it was a genuine shift in the balance of the world, or just a bruise that faded once the population came back and the rate quietly fell to where the men with the ledgers had always wanted it. And here is your quirk to fall asleep on. Travellers in Spain in later centuries came home and reported holidays adding up to something like 5 months of the year and said, the way you might say it, half scandalised, half envious, entirely sure that somebody somewhere was getting away with something. Nobody was getting away with anything. Not here, not at this price. So let's leave the field for a while and the ledgers and the rate that is now illegal to ask for, and let us go somewhere quieter, because there is a thing I have been holding back, and it is the strangest thing in this whole story. You have a name for what you feel at about 3 in the afternoon. Several names, actually. You have a whole shelf of them, and an algorithm that recommends more, and a friend who says the word burnout with the particular flatness of someone who has said it about themselves too many times. You think this is new, you think it's a modern injury delivered by modern machinery, an original wound of the notifications age. It is not new. It is so not new that a man sat in a desert in the late 4th century and wrote it down, in order, with a diagnosis attached. His name is Evagrius of Pontus, and he made a list, 8 of them. 8 kinds of thought that come for a person who is trying to live a good life. In a quiet place, 8 genera of evil thoughts, he called them, and you would recognise most of the list because it is mostly the greatest hits. The appetites, the anger, the vanity. Ordinary human weather. But one of them he singles out. One of them he calls the most troublesome of all, not the most wicked, not the most shameful, the most troublesome, which is a wonderfully worn-down, exhausted, deeply practical word to reach for, the word of a man who has met this thing personally and has stopped being impressed by the others. The word is acedia, and he gives it a nickname that is so good it should be a film. He calls it the noonday demon, borrowing it from a line in a psalm, the 90th, verse 6, where something walks about in the middle of the day. Not at midnight, not in the small hours where you would put a demon if you had any sense of theatre. Noon, broad daylight. The middle of the working afternoon, when the light is flat and hot and nothing is happening and nothing is going to happen, and there is no drama available anywhere, and that is precisely when it comes for you. Whoever put that image together understood something about human beings that took the rest of us about 1600 years to catch up on. Despair does not necessarily arrive in the dark with a candle guttering. Quite often it arrives at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in perfectly adequate lighting, while you are technically fine. The idea travels west, carried by a man called John Cassian, who takes what the desert learned and hands it to Latin Christendom, where it settles in and becomes part of the furniture. And Cassian, describing what this actually looks like in a real person in a real room, gives us a picture that I would like you to sit with for a moment, because I think about it more than is probably healthy. He describes monks looking about anxiously this way and that, sighing that no brother comes to visit them, and going out and looking up at the sun frequently as if it were too slow in setting. That is it. That is the whole thing. Somebody wrote that down more than a millennium and a half ago, and it is a man refreshing an empty inbox. Looking this way and that is you checking 3 apps in rotation and finding nothing in any of them, and then checking the first one again in case it has changed in the last 11 seconds. Sighing that no brother comes to visit. That is the specific undignified ache of a phone that is not ringing. And glancing up at the sun, as if it is too slow in setting. My friend, that is the clock in the corner of your screen. That is you at 3:30 doing the arithmetic on how much of the afternoon is left and being genuinely offended by the answer. The Desert Fathers did not have a clock. They had the actual sun, and they still stood outside and glared at it for not moving fast enough. There is no new thing under the sun, including the sun being annoying. But here is the turn, and it is a genuine loss. Acedia does not survive as itself. Along comes Pope Gregory I, who is tidying up the list. Because everyone who inherits a list eventually decides it needs tidying. That is simply what happens to lists. And he takes Evagrius's Tristitia, which is sadness, and he takes Acedia and he folds them together. And what comes out the other side, sitting in the finished set of capital vices, is sloth. Sloth. That is the merger. A word that now means a man who will not get off the sofa, and a very slow animal that hangs upside down in a tree, and is frankly thriving. Do you see what that costs? Acedia was an observation. It was a description of a state, the restlessness, the flat light, the anxious looking about, the time that will not move, and by merging it into sloth, the whole apparatus quietly reclassified it from a thing that happens to you into a thing you are doing wrong. It stopped being weather and became a verdict, and a thing that had been named and watched and taken seriously for centuries effectively disappeared as a distinct idea, hidden inside a word about laziness, for a very long time. Historians still argue whether acedia was depression wearing older clothes, or burnout centuries before there were offices to burn out in, or genuinely what its accusers said it was: a moral failing, a slackness of the soul, a person choosing not to try. The argument has not been settled, and I do not think it can be, because the people arguing are also the people it happens to, and you can decide for yourself which it is at about 3 p.m. tomorrow, when the light goes flat, and you find yourself looking this way and that, and the sun takes its time. They had the demon before you did. They just gave it a better name. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the question you would ask if you were awake enough to ask it. Fine, they knew about the ache. They had a word for it, and a psalm for it, and a demon for it with a decent working schedule. So what did they do about it? And here I have to be honest with you because I would rather be honest than tidy. I cannot hand you a remedy. There is no recipe coming. I'm not going to name you a physician who never existed, or read you a list of herbs I have invented, in a soothing voice while you are too sleepy to check, because that is exactly the sort of thing this genre does at 2 a.m, and it is a small betrayal every time. There were herbs. Of course there were herbs. There is not a century in human history without somebody confidently steeping something. But I do not have the leaf and the dose and the name of the woman who knew, and so I am not going to pretend I do. What I can tell you is what the village actually did, because the village did not treat this the way you treat it. You treat the ache as a private malfunction, a thing that has gone wrong inside one specific person, to be diagnosed inside that person, managed by that person, in a room, alone, at their own expense, in the evening, after work. The village did not do that. The village did not really have a category for a purely interior problem, because it did not really have a category for a purely interior person. So look at what they build instead, and notice that none of it is prescribed and all of it is structural. Start with the day itself, because the day is a treatment and nobody planned it that way. Yes, it runs dawn to dusk, which in summer is a monstrous stretch of light. 16 hours of it, and in winter shrinks to about 8, and everybody agrees that this is fine and goes to bed. But the day is not 16 hours of labour. It is nowhere close. The day is intermittent. It is punctured. There is breakfast in it. There is lunch. There's a refreshment break in the mid-morning and another in the mid-afternoon, and this is the one I want you to hear properly. There is a nap. A customary afternoon nap, not a stolen one, not a shameful one, not a nap you take with your office door closed pretending to be on a call. A customary one, which means it is a rule, which means somebody putting a boot in your ribs and shouting about productivity would be the one breaking the norm, not you. And notice where the nap falls. Mid-afternoon, right in the middle of the demon's shift. Whatever else that is, it is a village that has arranged, entirely without theory, to be unconscious during the worst hour of the day, then the rhythm underneath it. The work here is not measured against a number you can miss. It is task-shaped. You're not doing 8 hours, you're getting the hay in. The task lengthens the day or shortens it, and when the task is done, the day is done, and there is no separate ledger somewhere quietly noting that you were 4 hours light. There is almost no line between work and life at all. The talking and the labour are the same activity. The gossip happens over the same furrow as the cutting, and a man who works slowly while telling a long story is not stealing anything from anyone. He's just a man telling a long story. This sounds like nothing. It is not nothing. It means there is no clock you can fail, and then the big machinery. The holy days, which are not days off in your sense. They are days that belong to everyone at once. The whole apparatus of the year, dropping a festival into the calendar with the reliability of a heartbeat. Ascension Day, on the Thursday after Rogation Sunday. Whit Sunday, 10 days after that. May Day, and Corpus Christi, which England has been keeping since 1318, wandering around the calendar between the 21st of May and the 23rd of June, depending on where Easter fell that year. Dragging the whole town out into the street. At York they put on plays for something like 200 years running. 2 centuries of the same civic production, which means that somewhere in there are generations of people who played a part their grandfather played, badly, in the rain. And the church ails, where the parish sells beer to fix the parish, which remains the single most elegant piece of fundraising ever devised. There are plays of Robin Hood or St. George. There is dancing, and there is a king and queen elected presiding over all of it, a person who was pulling turnips out of the ground on Tuesday, wearing a crown on Sunday, absolutely insufferable about it by Monday. Here is your quirk, and it is a good one. On some saints' days and holy days, villages arranged fights, not brawls that broke out, fights that were organised, as entertainment on the calendar, a scheduled outlet. Somebody in the parish looked at the accumulated low-grade hostility. Of 40 people who have all known each other since birth and cannot leave, and thought, we should give that a fixture. It is not therapy, but it is not nothing either, and it is more than you have got. Historians still argue whether any of this actually helped. Whether the festivals and the naps and the noise were genuinely load-bearing for the medieval mind, or whether we are simply looking at a calendar and reading comfort into it because we would like there to be some, and because it is very easy to romanticize other people's Tuesdays from a great distance. But the shape is real, and the shape is the point. Rest that is customary, not requested. Ritual that arrives whether you booked it or not. Music that happens in the street rather than in your ears. Work that ends when it ends. And a community that is not something you have to schedule. That is not a cure. It is just a life with fewer places for the demon to stand. And there is one more piece of the machinery, and it is the piece I find hardest to look at without something complicated happening in my chest, because the ache is one thing. The flat afternoon, the demon at noon, the sun that will not set. But underneath the ache in almost everybody in every century, there is a second thing, older and heavier and much more embarrassing to admit to, which is guilt. The low continuous hum of having done something, or not done something, or being, in some way you could not defend in front of a jury but are entirely certain about at 2 a.m, not quite what you should be. You have that. You know you have that. And here is the question nobody asks you. What is your procedure for getting rid of it? You do not have one. That is not an insult. It is just true. You have coping. You have processing, which is a word that means thinking about it repeatedly, and calling it work. You have at best a conversation with someone kind who says none of that was your fault, which is lovely and lasts about 40 minutes. But you do not have a procedure. There is no moment in your calendar where a thing is named out loud, in a specific place, at a specific time, by a person whose actual job it is to receive it, and then formally, ceremonially, with authority, lifted off you. Nobody in your life has the power to lift anything off you. You're carrying every single thing you have ever done, and there is no counter you can put it down on. They had a counter. That is what the whole apparatus of confession and penance is, if you strip the theology away and look at it as plumbing. It is a mechanism for the disposal of guilt, and the reason it works, insofar as it works, and hold that thought, is that it has all the parts you are missing. It is scheduled. It comes round with the calendar, the way the bells come round, whether you feel like it or not, which means you cannot avoid it by simply never getting to it, the way you avoid everything else. It is spoken. The thing has to leave your mouth and enter the air, and anyone who has ever said a bad thing out loud for the first time knows that the saying is most of the work. It is received. Somebody hears it and does not run out of the building. It is priced. There is a penance, an actual assigned thing to do, which converts an unbounded feeling into a finite task. And then, and this is the part your world simply does not have, it is lifted, formally, by someone with the standing to lift it. And it is gone. Not gone in the sense that you have talked yourself around it. Gone in the sense that the transaction is closed and the ledger is marked. There is even a catalogue, which sounds bureaucratic and is actually a kindness. By the time this is all running properly, the sins have been counted and sorted. Evagrius made his 8, and Gregory I folded and tidied them down into the capital vices, and what you end up with is a finite list of ways a human being can go wrong. Finite. That is the gift. You cannot be failing in an infinite number of directions if there are only 7 of them and they are written down. Compare that with your situation, where the number of ways you might currently be a disappointment is limited only by your imagination, which is unfortunately excellent, because that is the trade, and it is a strange one. You got freedom from the whole system, and what you got instead was unbounded liability. Nobody tells you what your duties are, so you assume they are everything. Nobody tells you when you have done enough, so you never have. Nobody has the authority to absolve you, because you dismantled the office and did not build a new one. And so the case stays open forever. And you are the defendant and the judge and the only witness, and you're not a fair judge, are you? You never have been. You are appallingly harsh with the defendant. Now, honesty, because I promised. This is not a fairy tale, and the exit door has a second door behind it. Go and look at Montaigu, that little village in the Ariège Pyrenees up in the mountains minding its own business between 1294 and 1324. The only reason you know anything about those people at all, their beds, their arguments, their opinions about God and sheep and each other, is that Jacques Fournier, the Bishop of Pamiers, sat down between 1318 and 1324 and interviewed them, and wrote all of it down, meticulously. He was an acute psychologist. He was also pitiless, and he went on to become Pope. This single richest record of ordinary medieval interior life we possess exists because a brilliant, merciless man was very, very good at getting people to talk about what was inside them, and had reasons for wanting it that had nothing to do with their comfort. And their own curé, Pierre Clergue, the man in the village whose job it was to receive all this, brutal, powerful, and entirely capable of handing his enemies to the Inquisitor, when it suited him. So the confessor could be the safest man in your world or the most dangerous, and often you did not get to choose, and sometimes he was both in the same week. Historians still argue whether all that machinery consoled more than it frightened, whether the ordinary villager went home lighter, or simply went home having said out loud to a man with a register exactly the things that could later be read back to them. Hold both. It is what this whole night keeps asking of you. But the counter was real. There was a place to put it down. You would like a counter. Admit it. You're lying there right now with the whole pile on your chest and no one to hand it to. But before you get too comfortable in that village, and you are getting comfortable, I can hear it, you have been lying there for the last 10 minutes quietly pricing up a cottage. Let me take the cosy thing away from you for a while, because I've been telling you about naps and bells and the king and queen of the church ale, and if I stop there I have lied to you by arrangement, which is the most respectable kind of lying and still lying. Here is the part of the medieval world that nobody puts in the soft focus painting. You're surrounded by paperwork, not the flimsy kind, the kind with teeth. Start with the simplest fact, which is that you do not own yourself. Not entirely. Not in the way you assume the word owning works. There is a lord, and the lord has a claim, a real enforceable written down claim on your labour, not on your output, on your body and its hours. There is such a thing as boon work, which is work you do on his land for him, because you owe it. And the fact that it lands in the exact week your own strip needs you most is not a coincidence, and is not negotiable, and there is nobody to escalate it to. Your harvest has a competitor, and the competitor sets the schedule, then rent, then tithes which come off the top before you have worked out whether there is anything underneath the top, then taxes, which arrive from further away and are somehow always about a war you have not been consulted on, and then debt, which is the quiet one, the one that does not announce itself, the one that starts as a favour in a bad year and is still there 4 years later doing arithmetic in the dark. and all of it is written down. That is the thing people get wrong about this century. They imagine it as pre-administrative, as a world too muddy and too illiterate for bureaucracy, a place where you could simply disappear behind a hedge and be free. No, the medieval world is a world of records. It is obsessed with records. There is a court in your village, and it meets and it remembers, and the memory is written, and the writing outlives the man who wrote it and the man he wrote it about. Look at how deep it goes. When somebody dies suddenly, a fall, an accident, something nobody expected, the machinery does not just come for the dead, it comes for whoever found them. The coroner is summoned, and the sheriffs and a jury is called from the ward where the death happened and from the wards next to it, and that jury can be 12 men, or it can be closer to 50, which is an extraordinary amount of your neighbours to have standing in a room being official at each other, and they record the place, and the name, and the circumstances, and the verdict, and the jurors' names, all of them, and the name of the first finder, the actual person who walked in and saw it. And then, because that is not enough, they record the names of the pledges, the people who vouch for the first finder, who stand for him. Which means that in this world, discovering something terrible does not make you a witness. It makes you a legal category. You have to be vouched for. Somebody has to guarantee you on the record forever, because you were the one who happened to open the door. That is your quirk, and it is not a warm one. There is a negligence case from 1396 sitting in those records. Someone, 630 years ago, was found to have not been careful enough, and the not being careful enough was written down, and here it is, still legible, still saying so. Your world will forget your worst afternoon in about a week. Theirs kept the receipt, and the leash goes further up than the manor. Remember 1351, and what the Statute of Labourers actually says underneath the wage caps. Work is not a thing you choose. If you are able, and you are asked, you take it, at the rate they name. There is a law about the price of your hands, and later, under Henry VII, an act in 1495 sits down and legislates the working day itself. Winter from sunrise to sunset, and in summer from 5 in the morning until 8 at night. 5 in the morning, written into statute. There is a parliament in England that has taken the time to specify in law exactly when you get up. So when I tell you that medieval time was not measured against a clock you could fail, understand precisely what I mean and precisely what I do not. I do not mean nobody was counting. Everybody was counting. There were more people counting you than count you now. The steward, the priest, the court, the jury, the lord, the king, and every single neighbour you have, who all know exactly what you owe and to whom, and since when. It is simply that they were counting different things. They were counting duties, and days, and debts, and dues. They were not counting your productivity, because the concept had not been invented yet. And honestly, you should not thank them for that, because what they had instead was a claim on your actual physical body in the 4th week of August, and the thing that finishes it, the thing that makes all the rest of it heavier than any of it deserves to be on its own, is that there is no exit. None. You cannot resign from a manor. You cannot move cities and start again as someone with a clean file. You cannot go somewhere the record does not follow, because the record is your neighbours, and your neighbours are the only world there is. Whatever you are in that village at 17, you are broadly still it at 50, and everybody remembers, and there is no fresh start available at any price. Historians still argue whether all that structure was, on balance, a cage or a scaffold, whether being held that tightly by that many people was mostly a weight to carry, or mostly a floor to stand on. And I suspect the honest answer is that it depended entirely on whether the village liked you. Fewer hours is not less suffering. Hold that. It has to sit right next to the naps and the ale and the plays, and it does not cancel them, and they do not cancel it. And here is the quiet thing about all of it. The tithe sheaf leaning in the corner, the debt you owe the alehouse and the debt the alehouse owes you, both of them written down in nobody's book and remembered perfectly by everybody's mother. The boon work, the rent, the small, endless obligations that sit on your shoulders. In this village, like a cat that has decided your lap is now public property, not one of them is measured in minutes. They are measured in sheaves, in loads, in a strip of land ploughed, a hedge laid, a day given at harvest, in seasons. Your whole life is denominated in things, and in the doing of things, and never once in the ticking of anything. You owe a day. You do not owe 8 hours. And a day in this world is a wonderfully slippery unit. A day is however long the thing takes. In high summer, the light stretches out for something close to 16 hours, and the work stretches out with it, and in the black pit of December you get 8 hours if you're lucky, and the work shrinks to fit, because there is no arguing with the dark. Your bell rings, yes. Your bell has been ringing for the whole of this script, from the first grey shiver of morning to the last soft note over the roofs. But the bell is a servant. The bell answers to the sun, and to the priest, and to the feast on the calendar, and to the season. The bell is not telling you what time it is. The bell is telling you what is happening. There is a difference, and it is the difference this entire episode has been walking toward, slowly, in wet boots. Because somewhere out there, in the great stone churches, in the towers of towns you will never see, in the workshops of men who spent their lives thinking about weights and gears, and the beautiful stubborn problem of how to make a falling thing fall slowly and evenly forever, somebody builds a machine that keeps time. Not a sundial. A sundial is a polite conversation with the sky. A sundial says, "I don't know, ask the sun. The sun's the one with the information." Not a candle marked in rings, not a bowl of water dripping into another bowl. A machine, metal, weights, an escapement, a little mechanical stutter, a thing that catches and releases, and in doing so chops the endless smooth fall of a weight into countable pieces. Tick. And then, with the patience of something that will never once be tired or hungry or in love or grieving, tick. The genius of it is also the horror of it. The machine does not look at the sky. The machine does not care what the sky is doing. You can hang cloud over that town for 11 days. You can bury it in fog until the tower is a rumour, and the machine goes on asserting in the dark, in the wet, with absolute confidence that it is the hour it says it is. It has no doubts. It has never had a doubt in its life. It is the most self-assured object ever built by a species otherwise famous for hedging. And that is the pivot. Before the machine, time is something the sun does, something the year does, something the wheat does when it turns and dries and tells you, without being asked, that it is now, right now, drop your cup the moment. After the machine, time is something a device asserts. Time becomes a claim. And the moment time is a claim rather than an observation, it can be written down. And the moment it can be written down, it can be owned. And the moment it can be owned, my friend, it can be bought, sold, rented, stolen, wasted, saved, and you can be late for it. You have never been late for anything in your life. Not here, not in this village. You have been slow and you have been lazy. And you have certainly been accused of both by a reeve with a personal vendetta and a very good memory. But late? Late requires a thing to be late against. Late requires a number that existed before you got there and will sit in judgment over you when you arrive. There is no such number in this mud. The number is coming, though. You can hear it in the law. Late in the medieval world, under Henry VII in 1495, a statute goes out that tries to pin the working day of a labourer to something specific, and what it reaches for is astonishing in its ambition and slightly pathetic in its tools. In winter, sunrise to sunset, which is the old honest answer, the sky's answer. But in summer, 5 in the morning until 8 at night, numbers, actual numbers in an actual statute for actual bodies. Somebody in a room in London decided when your morning starts. He did not ask the sun. He did not ask you. Historians still argue whether the clock changed the way people thought about time, or whether people who had already started thinking about time as a thing to be counted and squeezed went out and commissioned a machine that would agree with them, whether the invention made the anxiety, or the anxiety commissioned the invention. And there is something older still sitting underneath all of it, which is that people have always wanted the day to hurry up. Long before any gear turned in any tower, a monk in the desert was described looking up at the sun again and again, over and over, as if it were being deliberately slow about setting. That is the oldest recorded version of checking the clock, except he had no clock. He had the sky, and the sky refused to be rushed, and so he stared at it anyway, which, honestly, is exactly what you do at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and you have a clock, and it doesn't help either. Nothing helps. The machine just made it possible to be precise about your suffering. So the clock arrives in the world, and it begins quietly, politely, with no announcement and no bad intentions, to eat it. It eats slowly and it eats politely, and the person who described the meal best was a historian named Edward Palmer Thompson, who in 1967 published an essay in a journal called Past and Present, with a title so dry you could strike a match on it: Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism. It is one of those pieces of writing that goes off in your head like a small bulb in a cellar you thought you knew, and the word he gives you, the word this whole muddy episode has been circling since the first bell, is task orientation. Task orientation. Here is what it means. And it means it exactly, so listen with the sleepy half of your brain, because that half understands it better anyway. In a task-oriented world, the work is the task, not the hours, the task. The cow needs milking, you milk the cow. The task is finished when the cow is finished, and the cow is the one who decides, and you may take this up with the cow if you like. The hedge needs laying, you lay it until it is laid. The day, Thompson says, lengthens or contracts according to the task, which is the most quietly radical sentence about work anybody has written. Because look at what it does. It makes the day the servant of the job, not the other way around. Your day is a bag, and the task is what goes in the bag, and the bag stretches. And the second half of it, the part that people miss because they are so busy being charmed by the first half. In a task-oriented world, there is the least possible demarcation between work and life. Labour and social intercourse intermingle. Those are his terms, and they are worth keeping, because they describe your whole existence out here. You have been working this entire episode. You have also been gossiping this entire episode. These were not two activities. You cannot draw the line between them because there is no line. You talked about the priest's brother while you bound sheaves. You settled a boundary dispute. At the alehouse, you did half a day's business in the churchyard after Mass, and you would have been surprised to be told any of it was a meeting. There is no commute. There is no clocking on. There is no small, terrible moment where the leisure stops and the labour starts, because they were never separated in the first place. They grew up in the same house and share a bed and finish each other's sentences. That is the world you're standing in with cold feet. Now watch it get taken apart. By around 1700, and you are not there. You are centuries dead, but your great-great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren are... The pieces are already assembling. Timesheets, timekeepers, informers, which is such a wonderfully sinister little word to find in a sentence about work. And fines, money taken off a person for the crime of existing at the wrong minute. Somebody, somewhere, is now paid to notice when you arrive. That is a job. That is a whole human being whose whole life is arrivals, and roughly 70 years after that, all of it lands with the full weight of stone in the early cotton mills, where the machinery does not lengthen or contract according to the task. Because the machinery is the task, and it does not get tired, and it will not wait for you to finish your story about the priest's brother. Thompson lists the mechanisms. This is the part where I want you to sit up very slightly, which I know is a lot to ask at this hour. The tools used to convert task-oriented people into time-disciplined people were supervision, fines, the wage incentive, pay them by the hour and watch them start counting hours, watch them do the counting themselves for free in their own heads forever, preaching, so that punctuality becomes a virtue and lateness becomes a small sin against God, which is efficient of them, because now you are guarding yourself. Schooling, so that the children arrive pre-installed with the habit, which is the most elegant move in the entire list. Bells and clocks. And one more, read the list again and find it. The suppression of fairs and sports. Sit with that for a second. It is on the list. It is right there, filed between the schoolteacher and the bell, listed as a mechanism of work discipline, in the same breath as fines and informers, because they understood something that we forgot almost immediately afterward. You cannot fully own a person's hours while they still have somewhere else to be. The fair is somewhere else to be. The game in the field, that shrieking, muddy, unrefereed disaster you played not so long ago, the one that no proclamation could kill, the one that Edward II tried to ban in London in 1314 to preserve his precious peace, the one where a canon called William de Spalding kicked a ball at Shudham Priory in 1321, and a man died, and the Pope himself had to sit down and write a dispensation about it. That game is somewhere else to be. It is time that is not for sale. It is unauditable. Nobody knows how long a game lasts, because a game lasts until it is over, which is the same grammar as the cow. So they did not just take the hours, they took the games. That is not a metaphor, and it is not a flourish. It is an item on a list in a history essay, and it is the coldest item on it. The stopwatch and the whistle came later, and they came for the games too. And now the games have hours as well, and injury time, and the injury time has a number, and a man holds the number up on a board so that you can watch the fun being measured. Historians still argue whether Thompson's clean before and after is too clean, whether the old world was ever really as unhurried as the essay implies, or whether he was a man of his own century writing a love letter to a village that never quite existed. Fair enough, maybe, but nobody has ever seriously argued about the list. The list is just there, in the archive, in the mill rules, in the fines ledger, in the parish sermon. Supervision, fines, the wage, the pulpit, the schoolroom, the bell, and the quiet cancelling of the fare. Which brings us at last to the number. You knew there was a number. There is always a number, because a claim like the one in the title of this episode does not travel across the internet on vibes alone. It travels on a number, and here it is. In 1991, an economist named Juliet Shaw published a book called The Overworked American. Subtitled The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, and in it she put two figures next to each other in a way that has been quietly detonating in people's heads ever since. A 13th century English peasant, adult, male, works something in the region of 1,620 hours in a year. The average American in 1987 worked 1,949, and if you want it fresher, the figure for 2017 comes in around 1,780, which is lower than 1987, and still, look at it, still above the man in the mud. 329 hours, that is the gap between you and the peasant. In 1987, money. That is 8 working weeks. That is a person in a shirt sitting in a meeting for 2 entire months about nothing, while a man in wet wool in the 13th century leans on a hedge and watches him do it. And there is more, and the more is worse. Shaw points out that in high-wage periods and 14th century England after the plague, when there were suddenly far fewer hands and every one of them knew exactly what it was worth, is the great example. Peasants might work no more than 150 days in the year. 150. And that the holiday leisure of medieval England came to something like a third of the year. A third? Not a fortnight in August and a long weekend you spend answering email in a hotel bathroom so your family can't see your face. A third of the year, structurally, by calendar, by custom, by God's own timetable. And it wasn't only England. Under the old French regime you get 52 Sundays, plus 90 rest days, plus 38 holidays on top, which is arithmetic that will make a modern payroll department lie down in a dark room. And travellers in Spain came back reporting holidays that added up to something like 5 months a year, which sounds like a lie, and may well be a lie, and is exactly the kind of thing a traveller says about somewhere sunnier than home. So, there it is. The title of this episode vindicated, case closed, everyone to the alehouse. Except no. Because this is the part of the night where I have to be honest with you, and honesty is the only thing I have that a thumbnail doesn't. That number is heavily qualified and heavily disputed, and the people doing the disputing are not cranks. Start with the 150 days. It applies at best to a specific and narrow window, a high-wage moment, a particular kind of worker, in a particular set of decades after a catastrophe had made labour scarce and precious. It is not a description of the medieval millennium. It's a snapshot taken in an unusual light, and then framed and hung in a corridor where everyone walks past and assumes it is a portrait of the whole family. Fact-checkers have gone at it and come back with the same verdict every time. Not exactly false, not remotely as clean as it travels. Then there is the phrase hours worked, which is doing an enormous amount of unstated labour of its own. What counts? Walking to the strip counts. Mending the tool counts. The hour you spend at the manor court because you're legally obliged to stand there while your neighbours discuss whose pig it was. Is that work, or is that civic life? Or is it entertainment, given the quality of the pig discourse? Remember what Thompson just told you. In a task-oriented world, there is the least possible demarcation between work and life. Which is beautiful, and which also means that any attempt to count the work hours in that world requires somebody, 7 centuries later, to walk in and draw a line that the people living there never drew and would not have recognised. You are not measuring the past, you are measuring the ruler. And then there is the thing that makes the whole edifice creak loudest. Look again at the phrase, 13th century English adult male peasant. Male. Where is the woman? She's not in the number and she was not idle. The brewing, the baking, the water, the fire, the cloth, the children, the sick, the old, the dead laid out. None of that stops for a saint's day because saints do not feed anybody's baby at 3 a.m. Nobody's holiday was ever her holiday. The leisure in that famous statistic is, to a considerable degree, leisure that somebody else was working through, and she left no timesheet because nobody had invented one yet, and when they did invent one they did not think to hand her a copy. Historians still argue whether medieval work can be counted in hours at all, without smuggling in the entire modern idea of an hour, and quietly deleting half the population in the process. And here is the last twist, the one I like the most, the quirky little sting in the tail of the whole argument. Shaw's book was itself a rebuttal. She wasn't writing to romance the Middle Ages. She was writing against a chorus from the 1930s and 40s who had confidently promised that capitalism, machines, efficiency, all of it, would hand the ordinary person more leisure. The 15-hour week, the problem of what to do with all that free time, the great looming crisis of boredom. Somebody genuinely worried about that. Professionally, in print. And Shaw reached back to a 13th century peasant not because he was living the dream, but because he was a stick, and she wanted a stick, and he was the longest one in the shed. So the honest verdict on the number is this. It is not a fact you can lean on. It is an argument you can think with. And an argument you can think with is worth more than a fact you can tweet, which is why we are still here in the dark at this hour holding it. So let's do the ledger properly. Both columns, no cheating, and I'll go first on the side that hurts. Medieval life was not better. I want to say that plainly, because there is a whole genre of gauzy nonsense out there that would have you believe otherwise, and I am not going to sell it to you at 11 at night when your defences are down and you're already half in love with a hedge. It was not better. It was in most of the ways a body can measure considerably worse, and the worse is not abstract, and it does not soften if you look at it in candlelight. Famine, not hunger, not skipping lunch. Famine, the real thing, the kind that arrives because the rain came at the wrong time in the wrong month and there is no second system underneath the first one. Plague, which does not knock. Ergotism, which comes up out of the bread itself, which is a special cruelty. The loaf, the one honest thing in your life turning on you. Pain with nothing to put on top of it. Nothing, not a thing. You will hold hands and you will bite down. And that is the entirety of the medical apparatus available for the worst hour of your life. And the children. The coroner's rolls in this world catch everything, every sudden and unnatural death. A jury of 12 or 50 neighbours summoned from the ward to stand in a doorway and agree on how it happened. The first finder named, his pledges named. The whole village pressed into the recording of it. And in those rolls, among the drownings and the falls and the fights, you find a child drowned in a pan of milk. A pan of milk. That is the sentence, and it is 700 years old, and it is on parchment because somebody stood in a room and swore to it. There is another buried under sand in a sandpit. This is the world with less stress in it, apparently. And then the thing that is worse than any of it, the item at the bottom of the column that outweighs the rest by a distance. There is no exit. None. You're in this village, and this village is who you are, and there is no other village that will have you, and there is no moving on, no starting over, no fresh start in a warmer town under a name you like better. Ask Pierre Maury, the shepherd of Montaillou, who was as free as a man in that world could be, who walked the mountains, who had his own mind, who came back from Spain and walked straight into the Inquisitor's prison and out of the record forever, and that is where the story of the freest man in the village stops, mid-sentence, because a bishop wanted a word. After the plague, when working people finally had leverage for once in 1,000 years, the answer in 1351 was the Statute of Labourers, which capped their wages and compelled them to work. That is what happened the one time the arithmetic broke in their favour. They passed a law against it. Fewer hours does not mean less suffering. It never did. Put that at the top of the ledger in letters big enough to see from the back. Now the other column, and it is narrower than the title of this episode implies, and it is truer than the title too. Their time was shaped differently. That's it. That is the whole claim, and it is smaller than you wanted and better than you expected. Their time was task-oriented. The day lengthened and contracted around the work instead of the work being poured into a mould with a number stamped on the bottom. It was seasonal, which means it had an end, which means the misery had an end because the dark goes and the light comes and it has never once failed to. It was communal, which means that whatever was happening to you was happening in the presence of people who would notice. You were never the only one holding it, and it was not measured against a machine you could fail. That last one is the whole thing. That is the pearl at the bottom of 24 sections of mud. They had exhaustion. They had grief and dread and boredom and the noonday demon and the appalling slowness of an afternoon. They had near enough every ache you have, but they did not have this one specific modern ache. The low electrical hum under everything. The sense of being behind. Behind a schedule you did not write. Behind people you have never met. behind a version of yourself that exists only as a number on a device that is, right now, in your hand or on your pillow, waiting. You cannot be behind in a task-oriented world. There is nothing to be behind. There is only the field and the light and the thing that needs doing, and when it is done, it is done, and the doneness is real, and you can see it from the gate. Historians still argue whether that difference is a genuine gain or just a trick of distance, whether we are seeing something real in the medieval day, or simply enjoying the fact that everyone in it is safely dead and can no longer contradict us. And that is a fair fight, and I am not going to pretend to settle it in a bedtime video. But hold both, that's all I'd ask. Hold both, because holding both is the only honest posture available. The one who lived here would have taken your dentist, your vaccines, your warm room, your exit, and your unimaginable ability to simply leave, and he would have taken them in a heartbeat, without a moment's sentimentality, and he would have thought you were mad for envying him. And still, he would not have understood what you meant by the feeling in your chest at 11 at night, when nothing is wrong, when everything is fine, when the work is done and the door is locked, and something in you keeps insisting without evidence that you are late. He'd have looked at you kindly. He'd have looked at the sky, out of habit, to check, and he'd have told you to go to bed. So go back, one last time, back through the gate and down the lane and into the village at the end of the day, because you started here, and it would be rude to leave without saying goodbye. It is dusk. The light has gone that particular colour it only goes in autumn, thin and gold and going, and the field behind you is finished. Not finished in the sense that the hours ran out, but finished in the sense that the thing is done, the strip is ploughed, the task has closed itself, and there is nothing left in it to do. Your back has an opinion about this. Your hands have several. There is dirt in the creases of your knuckles that is going to be there for the rest of your life, and you have made your peace with that in the way you make peace with weather. The bell goes, last one, soft over the roofs, and it isn't telling you a number, it's telling you a thing, that the day is over, that the light is going, that this is the shape of the end. You never once looked at a clock today. You did not check anything. Nothing pinged. Nothing was waiting for you in a small glowing rectangle tapping its foot. There was simply the light, and the work, and the people, and then less light, and then this. Smoke. Wood smoke. Low, lying along the street because the air is heavy. And it gets in your clothes and in your hair, and you will smell of it for the rest of your existence. And you have entirely stopped noticing. Someone's dog, having a strong view about something. Someone laughing 2 doors down, and you know exactly who it is because you know every voice in this village the way you know your own hands, which is a claim almost nobody alive today can make about their street, and which is either the most comforting thing in the world or a nightmare, depending on how much you like your neighbours. Inside. Low door. Duck your head. You have hit it before, and you will hit it again, because the door has been the same height for 40 years, and you have never once learned. The fire's banked. The room is small and dark and warm and smells of smoke and wool and people, and there is nothing in it that needs your attention, and no light in it that you can't put out. Something is boiled. Something is always boiled. You eat it standing mostly, and nobody has an opinion about the presentation, and nobody photographs it, and it is gone in 4 minutes, and it was honestly fine. And here is the last real thing I'll give you, the strangest and softest fact in the whole story. You are not about to sleep for 8 hours. Nobody here is. You're going to have a first sleep, down shortly after the sun goes, deep and heavy, right through to somewhere after midnight, and then you're going to wake. On purpose, not badly, not with your heart going, just awake, in the dark, in the quiet, for an hour or two, and it is not a problem, and it is not insomnia, and there is no word for it because it doesn't need one. That waking hour is yours. People prayed in it, talked in it, lay there and thought about absolutely nothing in it, and then, when it had run its course, they went down again into the second sleep and slept until the sun came and got them. The evidence for it sits in more than 500 places. Diaries, medical books, court records, poems. First sleep, second sleep mentioned casually, the way you'd mention lunch. And then it fades. Late 17th century mostly, right about the time the streets get lit and the world starts caring about efficiency, which is either a coincidence or the least subtle clue in history. Historians still argue whether that quiet middle hour was ever really universal, or whether we have gathered up scattered mentions across 400 years and pressed them into a single tidy custom that no actual person living then would have recognised as one. Maybe. Either way, if you wake tonight at 2 a.m. and lie there and your first instinct is to be frightened of it, be a little kinder than that. It might not be a fault. It might just be old. So that is the village, and that is the day, and that is the whole of what I came to tell you. The bell, the field, the mud, the game nobody could ban, the court in the churchyard, the ale, the saint who got you a day off, the number that was never quite true and never quite false, and the man who could not be late, because there was nothing in the world to be late against. That last one is the only claim I would defend to the end. Not that they were happier, not that they were safer, or better fed, or free, because they were frequently none of those things, and I have spent 2 hours refusing to pretend otherwise. Only this, the ache you carry, that low constant humming sense of being behind, needed a machine to invent it, and the machine had not been built yet. They had terrors you have never had to name. This particular one was not among them, and the last small mercy of the medieval night is that it asked nothing of you once the light was gone. There was no evening to optimize. There was no second shift of being a person. The dark arrived, and it simply took everything off the table, and everyone agreed to stop, together at the same time, because there was no other option and no glowing reason to pretend otherwise. Now, let go of the day. The fire is low, the room is warm, the door is shut, and there is nothing on the other side of it that wants anything from you. Let your shoulders come down. They have been up all day. They are allowed down now. Nothing is late. Nothing is behind. There is no bell that will ring for you tonight. The wool is rough and warm, and it smells of smoke. Breathe out, slowly, all the way out. Outside, the wind moves through the thatch. It has a small sound like a hand going over cloth. The dog has stopped. The village has gone quiet. Someone banks a fire 2 doors down, and then even that stops. The dark here is a real dark. Soft. Complete. There is no light in the corner of the room. No small glow waiting. There is no number in this room. Nothing here is counting. Your feet are warm. Your hands are still. The ache in your back is going slowly the way heat goes out of a stone. Let it go. The field is done. The gate is shut. The bell has rung. Everything that needed doing today was done today. What wasn't will keep until morning. And morning will come the way it always comes, without asking you, without hurrying, without a single word. There is nothing to solve now. There is nothing to answer. The day has closed itself, the way a task closes, the way a field closes when the last row is turned. Sleep now. The first sleep is deep, and it is long, and if you wake in the middle of it, in the dark, in the warm, in the quiet, you do not have to do anything about it. Just lie there. Let the night hold you. The sun will find you when it is ready.